Tonight, we'll listen to 3 timeless folk tales, following a forgotten branch of the caravan roads, where the desert keeps its oldest stories in silence and stone. A patient road that once carried saffron, blue dye, folded paper, dried figs, tea leaves, brass weights, and letters sealed with plum-coloured wax from one small town to another. We will travel beside a 12-year-old girl named Alia, who notices the soft scratch of brush on stone, the smell of warm cumin in storage rooms, and the way old wood changes its voice when it is ready to be touched again. Beside her walks her grandfather Farid, who is 79 years old, and remembers trade not as noise or riches, but as bowls set out for strangers, ledgers written by careful lamplight, and the shade offered before a tired traveller asks. Their story begins in the town of Kea, where roofs cool slowly after sunset, and market awnings fade beautifully in the wind, and where a long sleeping counting court waits beside an old trade route that has almost forgotten the weight of passing feet. There will be polished brass tokens, herb-scented water, reed screens, chalk lines, and a kind of gentle magic that arrives only after sweeping, carrying, recording, mending and listening. If your day has been full, let it loosen. The road tonight is wide, the stars are steady, and this is a story that means to carry you slowly into rest. If you enjoy wandering these quiet old roads with stories like this, you can softly subscribe, return whenever evening grows still, and let these lantern-lit routes, sleeping courtyards, and patient travellers keep you company again. Alia lived in the western quarter of Kea, where the streets bent gently toward the market and every house seemed to have at least one blue door faded by sun and polished by hands. The town stood where a main caravan road divided into 3 calmer branches. One ran north toward chalk ridges and paper mills. One drifted east towards saffron terraces and cool fig orchards. The third, older than the other 2 and less frequently used now, slipped southwest across gravel shelves and tamarisk hollows toward a chain of villages that still made blue dye, sweet tea brick and woven saddlecloths. Kea itself was not large, but it held the comfortable dignity of places that understand their own usefulness. At dawn the square smelled of yeast, wet clay, and warm milk. By noon it smelled of cumin, wool, donkey leather, and the dusty sweetness of dates. At sunset the alleys released the stored scent of stone cooling after heat, and people climbed to their roofs with quilts and tea, speaking more softly as the sky turned apricot and then plum. Alia's mother, Sadaf, sorted saffron threads and dried limes for a spice merchant whose shelves rose to the ceiling. Her father, Musa, repaired saddle straps and travelling bags with stitches so strong that drovers sometimes crossed 2 provinces just to ask for his work. Alia had a younger brother named Rami, who was 8 and carried every question in the world inside him at once, and she had grandfather Farid, who lived in the room nearest the fig courtyard, because he liked to hear the pigeons before dawn and the kettles after dusk. Farid's room held more small, useful treasures than any room Alia had ever known. On one shelf were rolled cloth ledgers tied with green cord. On another stood little brass weights shaped like pears, pomegranates, and smooth stones, each one rubbed bright by years of use. Beneath the window rested a flat board darkened by ink stains, with narrow grooves where a ruler had often been laid. There were also jars of sealing wax, folded paper packets containing old tally sticks, and a cedar box filled with small round trade tokens cut from brass, olive wood, fired clay, polished bone, and shell. Some tokens were plain, others stamped with symbols, a sheaf of saffron, a water jug, a folded rug, a fish-shaped lamp, a cup, a spiral for tea, a crescent over a well. When Alia was younger, Farid let her sort them into shallow trays by shape and weight. Later, when her fingers steadied, he taught her what they meant. Some marked bales paid for and collected. Some marked goods stored overnight in dry rooms. Some marked jars returned clean to their owners. Some represented the right to a bed ledge, a bowl of soup, fresh well water for animals, or shade until moonrise. Trade, Farid said, was not only buying and selling. Trade was agreement made visible, courtesy given shape, and movement across distance turned legible enough that tired people did not have to keep everything in their heads. Alia loved this idea. It made every weight, cord, stamp and mark feel like part of a language too practical to boast, and too graceful to disappear entirely. Though Farid no longer worked full days in the market, People still sought him whenever memory was needed more than speed. A rug merchant might come to ask how long indigo bundles should rest before crossing the hot flats. A drover might inquire whether a shuttered road station near the South Fork once had a second cistern hidden behind the wall. A widow, sorting old belongings, might arrive with a cracked seal, hoping Farid could tell which village mark it bore. He always received such visitors on the fig courtyard bench, never hurrying them, never speaking more loudly than the matter required. Alia often sat nearby threading date pits on string for drying or polishing cups with a cloth, half listening while he answered. He remembered which roots grew muddy after rare winter rains, which wells tasted of chalk rather than salt, which weighing houses had narrower ledges better suited to children, and which paper mills wrapped ledges in blue linen rather than plain cloth. He remembered, too, roads no longer commonly used, names that had slipped from ordinary speech, and side branches of trade that once connected towns now linked more easily by other ways. He never spoke of those older routes with bitterness. He spoke of them as one might speak of rooms in a family house that no one slept in anymore, but which still held good windows, sound cupboards, and pleasant afternoon light if only someone cared to open them. The forgotten road that would become Alia's road entered her life on an afternoon scented with coriander seed and warm dust. She was helping Sadaf in the spice shop, separating saffron threads from lighter yellow stamens and laying each into shallow lacquered trays. When a traveller arrived carrying a cloth-wrapped packet under his arm as carefully as if it contained a sleeping bird, he was an older mule driver named Bashir, whose beard had gone mostly silver, and whose hands always smelled faintly of wool, leather oil and fennel. He had come from the southwest villages by a longer track than usual because the main ridge road had grown crowded with wool carts. From the packet he drew not merchandise, but a square seal carved from dark olive wood. One edge had split and its cord was gone, yet the carved face remained, a balance beam beneath a climbing vine. Sadaf called Alia at once, for she knew symbols interested her, more than gossip ever would. Bashir said he had found the seal in a storage chest in a village dye house, where the old keeper was clearing shelves. No one there remembered the mark. It had once belonged, perhaps, to a branch court where goods were counted and held overnight, yet the name had slipped away. Sadaf turned the seal over twice, and then sent Alia running across the lane for Farid, who arrived with his cane tapping lightly, and his eyes already attentive before the seal even reached his palm. Farid looked at the carved vine and balance beam for a long while, not with uncertainty, but with that deep inward patience Alia associated with him. At last he smiled so slightly that only she noticed at first. The court of the vine measure, he said, sometimes called the counting garden of Sophia, though that was more of a nickname than its true name. It stood beside the Saffron Stair Road, an old trade branch that once linked the saffron terraces east of Care with the dye villages to the southwest, thus sparing traders a longer bend through the main square. Goods travelling that road were not the heaviest, but they were often delicate and high in value to the people who made them. Saffron, pressed tea leaf, folded paper, dyed silk cord, fig syrup, ink cakes, glass beads, and medicinal herbs kept cool in clay jars. Because such goods required careful tallying and short night storage, a counting court had been built midway between Care and the dye villages. Traders arrived by dusk, unloaded only what needed rest or reweighing, drank tea in a vine-shaded yard, slept on raised ledges, and departed at dawn with ledgers corrected and tokens returned. Bashir listened with pleasure. He had never heard the name. Sadaf asked whether the court still stood. Farid answered that it had when he last passed that way many years before, though its vines were already failing and the root had grown quieter each season. Then he turned the little seal between thumb and finger, and said, almost to himself, "I wonder whether the chalk lines remain." That evening the family drank tea in the fig courtyard while the blue of dusk deepened above them. Musa returned from the strap shop with his awl still tucked in his belt, and listened as Bashir's seal was passed to him. Rami wanted to stamp every scrap of paper in the house with it, until Sadaf forbade the idea at once. Alia sat cross-legged near Farid's chair, chin in her hands, while he described the counting court more fully. It was not grand, he said. Those who imagine forgotten trade routes picture carved gates and halls of silk, but the truest trade places were usually simple and exact. The court of the vine measure had a wall, a gate, a well, shaded ledges, a weighing table, a small room for ledgers and tokens, a shelf for cups, and a central floor marked with chalkstone lines where loads could be sorted and recorded. Along the inner wall were 7 shallow niches for numbered trays, each tray holding the root tokens assigned to one kind of courtesy or measure. Over the ledges had once grown a light vine on reed trellises, not to make fruit, but to soften the yard and hold back the fiercest afternoon glare. Alia asked what he meant by chalk lines. Farid smiled toward the courtyard bricks. On the floor, he said, pale lines had been inlaid with powdered chalk and gypsum, making rectangles and circles for temporary sorting. Bales here, jars there, bundles on that side, goods awaiting morning transfer in the western box. And because memory likes a little beauty, the lines formed a vine pattern when seen from the ledges above. Musa leaned back against the wall and asked the question Alia most wanted asked. Could the court still be used? Farid considered the air above his tea as though the answer might be hanging there in the fig leaves. If the well still draws, he said, if the roof room has not fallen, and if the road remains passable, then a place can wake more quickly than people expect. No one declared at once that they must go, because in that family useful decisions ripened rather than burst. Yet the idea entered the courtyard and stayed. Sadaf wondered aloud whether saffron traders might once again prefer a quieter, overnight stop when the harvest caravans thickened. Musa said an old counting court could spare strain on the crowded square if the ledgers were trustworthy. Farid turned the olive wood seal in his palm and admitted that the route had drifted into disuse less because it was poor, and more because no one had wanted the daily labour of keeping it ready. The main square required no special journey. The counting court required carrying oil, trimming ledgers, washing cups, and keeping measures honest beneath a roof that was not one's own house. Rami asked whether a place like that could miss footsteps. Farid answered yes, though not in the same way people missed them. A gate missed opening, a well missed being drawn before evening, a shelf missed stacked cups. Alia felt something in her chest settle around those words. She was old enough now to know that care did not make noise when it left, but absence shaped itself all the same. Before the tea tray had been cleared, Musa had already said he could spare a day after market tallying. Sadaf said she would pack food. Farid said they must begin with inspection, not celebration. Alia said nothing then, because if she spoke too quickly, the idea might sound like excitement rather than devotion, and she already knew it was the second that mattered more. They set out 2 mornings later before sunrise, when Kaya's square still belonged to bread makers, milk sellers, and the first pigeons landing on awning poles. Bashir had offered directions as far as the first tamarisk bend, though he did not join them, having other business in town. Musa loaded the donkey cart with a broom, 2 broad brushes, a hammer, a coil of rope, a leather bucket, folded shade cloth, bread, cheese, cucumbers, dates, lamp oil, 6 cups, a shastim, and a small chest of trade tokens that Farid insisted on carrying himself. Sadaf added a jar of mint syrup, for she believed all inspection went better if cool drinks were possible. Alia brought her notebook, 2 reeds for writing, and a small cloth roll containing chalk sticks because she liked to be ready for lines whenever lines might prove necessary. Farid wore his pale, brown outer robe and the hat with the broad, soft brim he reserved for long road mornings. Rami, after pleading with such intensity that even Sadaf laughed, was allowed to come on condition that he touch no hidden mechanism, climb no wall, and keep his curiosity inside the volume of ordinary speech. The sky paled slowly as they passed through the eastern gate, and then turned southward where the old branch peeled away from the busier road. It was immediately quieter there. The main route still carried its distant bell sounds and low animal breaths, but the saffron stair road seemed to keep its voice folded within itself, as though habit had taught it not to expect company. The land along that road changed with a softness Alia found beautiful. There were no dramatic cliffs or fearful drops, only long gravel shelves, pockets of wormwood, tamarisk hollows where shade lingered, and low rises of chalky stone that caught dawnlight like folded paper. Here and there worn milestone stumps stood beside the track, some fallen, some leaning, most nearly swallowed by dust. Farid asked Musa to stop whenever one appeared, and Alia watched him walk to each with a care that made the old stone seem almost dignified again. He would brush the top, feel for carvings, and name what little remained. 2 cups here meant a well within 1/2 day. A vine spiral meant measure court ahead. 3 short lines beneath a square once marked the branch to the paper villages. He explained that forgotten trade routes often remained legible even when people stopped reading them. A person had only to slow enough. Alia stored each sign in her notebook. Rami gathered pretty pebbles until Sadaf warned him not to fill the whole cart with geology. Once they passed a woman walking with 2 donkeys loaded in neat baskets with dried herbs. Hearing their destination, she said she'd always wondered whether the old court still had its shaded wall. Her grandmother used to speak of it when packing fever herbs for summer travellers. Farid answered that if it did not, perhaps it only needed new reed and willing hands. The woman smiled at this and pressed into Alia's palm a bundle of lemon balm tied with thread, saying a restored court should smell of rest as well as water. By late morning the road dipped between 2 chalk ridges and then opened into a shallow basin where a stand of old vine posts still rose at angles from the ground like thin, patient fingers. Beyond them lay the court of the vine measure. Alia had expected ruin in the grand way stories sometimes promised, but what she found instead was pause. A rectangular wall of pale clay brick still held. The gate leaned slightly but remained square. Inside the open arch she glimpsed ledges, the edge of a well curb, and a central floor softened by dust. One corner of the roofed record room had lost plaster, yet the beams beneath seemed intact. The trellis above the western ledges had mostly collapsed, but 2 lengths of old reed lattice still clung to the posts, and over one of them a living thread of vine, thin but green, had crept back from some unseen root. That small green line pleased Alia deeply. It made the court seem not abandoned but patient. She entered behind Farid, who touched the gatepost with his fingertips before stepping in. The air inside the wall was cooler than the open road. Not cold, just held. Along the eastern and western sides ran raised, sleeping ledges. The well stood in the northern half of the yard with a circular stone curb and a low platform beside it, probably for jars. Against the wall opposite the gate rose the weighing table, broad and waist-high, coated in dust but still severe in its proportions, and on the floor, where Farid had wondered whether anything remained, Alia saw beneath the powder the faintest geometry of pale lines, crossing and curving. The chalk pattern slept there still. No one rushed to claim the place, because rushing would have been rude. They first walked the perimeter in stillness, as one might quietly greet a room after many years. Farid pointed out the 7 wall niches near the weighing table, each holding a shallow tray of fired clay. 3 cracked, 4 whole. Sadaf discovered a cup shelf bowed but not broken. Musa tested the gate latch and smiled when it complained in a lively rather than hopeless voice. Rami knelt by the ledge base and shouted with delight that he had found a carved grape leaf in the plaster border, which indeed he had. Alia moved toward the central floor and used her cloth to brush away a palm-sized patch of dust. Beneath emerged 2 intersecting chalk-white lines, and between them a vine curl no wider than her hand. It was delicate and practical at once, like handwriting laid flat on stone. Farid saw her expression and nodded. "Those lines," he said, "once told weary people exactly where to place their goods, so nothing needed guessing by lantern light. A good trade court reduced confusion before it began." In the roofed record room they found a long shelf, a low chest with its lid fallen in, and a board on the wall marked with tiny holes where pegs had once held tagged strings. The room smelled of dust, dry clay, and something faintly sweet left by old wood. On the inner side of the door, still visible beneath cobwebs, someone had painted in small, careful script, "Count with clear hands, store with cool mind, depart with no doubt left behind." Alia read it twice, and then a third time, simply because the line pleased her so much. Work began in the way all good waking work begins, by carrying out what no longer belonged. Musa and Rami swept the yard's loose drift into neat piles, while Sadaf wiped the shelf and cup ledge with damp cloth. Alia brushed the floor cautiously, following the chalk pattern instead of attacking the dust broadly, and in this way more and more of the vine grid design emerged. The lines formed rectangles around a central circle, and each rectangle bore a tiny symbol pressed into the plaster at one corner. Jar, bale, bundle, roll, packet, crate, basket. Farid, meanwhile, went straight to the well. He lowered the leather bucket on the rope they had brought, pausing now and then to listen. When it reached water, the splash came up so cool and hollow that everyone looked toward him at once. The first bucket rose clear, the second clearer still. By the third, after the upper dust had been skimmed away, the well water shone pale green in the bucket's shadow. Farid drank and closed his eyes. "Good," he said simply. "Chalk cool and patient." Sadaf laughed in relief. Rami demanded a cup immediately. Alia held the bucket steady while Musa scrubbed the stone jar platform and the animal trough beside it, revealing grooves worn by many years of careful setting down. By midday they had already changed the court's feeling. Dust still lay everywhere, yet pathways had emerged. Key, the ledges could be seen as places to rest rather than shapes against the wall. The weighing table looked less like a ruin and more like a silent old worker waiting for hands. Alia liked that each object responded not dramatically but gratefully, as if remembering its own name. They ate under the eastern wall where a strip of shade lingered longest. Sadaf poured mint syrup into watered cups. Bread was broken. Cheese passed. Lemon balm from the road woman was crushed between fingers and dropped into the drinking jar so the water carried a soft green scent. While they ate, Alia asked Farid what exactly had happened here on a busy evening. His answer came slowly, like someone laying plates on a table one by one. First, animals watered outside the gate if the yard was already full. Then goods needing counting were brought to the chalk floor and set in their proper spaces. Ledgers were checked, weights compared. If two routes exchanged goods there, the tally marks were corrected before anyone slept. Small delicate things, saffron packets, wax, herbs, folded paper, were taken to the record room shelves for cool keeping. Tea was served. Travellers ate what they carried or bought from those who shared the road. After that, the ledgers became sleeping places, and the weighing table became a quiet square of shadow until dawn. Trade, he said, was often described by ambitious men as movement of value, but the people who kept roads knew a plainer truth. Trade was trust spread across distance. If measures failed, if goods were mislabelled, if cups were dirty, if storage was damp, then a road weakened without making a sound. Alia thought of the chalk lines again. They seemed less decorative now and more merciful, like instructions laid down kindly before tired minds needed them. After the meal, Farid asked Alia to help him inspect the record room properly. Together they lifted the fallen chest lid and found inside a scatter of clay markers, 2 cracked wax sticks, a tiny brass stamp with only part of its face left, and, under a scrap of linen, 4 intact counting weights shaped like little pears. On the shelf above lay what at first seemed to be pebbles, but when Alia brushed them free she found a row of root tokens, their surfaces dulled but legible. A tea spiral, a folded page, a basket, a vine leaf, a shaded cup, and a little starburst she did not know. Farid took the unknown one and smiled. Night storage cleared at dawn, he said. The token given when goods rested overnight and were collected before breakfast. Alia loved that such a specific courtesy had once required its own symbol. Behind the pegboard, where dust had thickened in folds, she found a shallow wall niche holding 3 chalk sticks wrapped in old thread. When she lifted one, it did not crumble. It only left her fingertips pale. She carried the find as if it were silver. Farid laughed softly and told her a court is fortunate when even its forgotten chalk remembers patience. On the lower shelf they discovered a ledger board with faint columns still visible, where ink had once guided careful writing. Alia traced the grooves with her finger, and imagined evenings in which names of traders, bundles, quantities, village marks, and token returns had been written there one after another while tea cooled and the lamps thickened toward amber. They stayed until late afternoon, working without haste. Musa rehung the gate properly and braced the western trellis posts so they would not fall. Sadaf washed the shelf and set 6 cups upon it in a row because, she said, places wake more easily when offered signs of their old customs. Farid set the olive wood seal with the vine and balance beam inside the record room on the upper shelf, and Alia, after thinking hard, placed 1 clean chalk stick in the niche beside it. Rami asked whether the court would be lonely after they left. Farid answered that loneliness was lessened by promise made clearly. Tonight, he said, the court has a shelf, water, cups, tokens, and the beginning of its lines. That is enough for one night. The road back to Kea glowed pale under the rising moon. Alia rode on the cart with dust on her sleeves, chalk on her fingertips, and the clear feeling that she had stepped into a story older than herself without once needing it to become loud. Kea received the news with the particular happiness towns reserve for good usefulness returning. In the square that evening, cups of tea were handed out before questions were even finished. Was the well sound? Yes. Were the ledges safe? Mostly. Did the chalk floor remain? More than anyone had hoped. Could the court be used this season? Farid answered that with labour, honesty, and a modest number of cushions. Yes. At once the square began to contribute itself. The paper seller offered a bundle of wrapped ledger sheets because a counting court deserved clean pages if any new tallying were to begin. The baker's wife sent word that fresh flatbreads would be available at dawn on the morning of reopening. A rug mender donated 2 woven seat pads for the record room. The woman from the herb road returned to town and, hearing the report, brought a basket of dried lemon balm, saying travellers on forgotten routes were often more tired because they had chosen quiet over convenience. Even the coppersmith, who seldom gave anything without grumbling first, said he had 3 spare lamp hooks and would part with 2 if someone came for them before noon. Alia loved listening as objects and skills joined the court one by one. It felt like watching a pattern weave itself across a loom, and each thread ordinary alone and more beautiful together. The next morning and the next passed in preparations. Musa cut 2 new trellis poles from stored wood and shaved them smooth. Sadaf sewed cushion covers from striped cloth that had once been intended for a guest bench. Farid sorted tokens at the fig courtyard table, placing them into categories Alia now knew by heart: storage, measure corrected, well water, animal water, bed ledge, cup returned, dawn departure. He let her clean each token with a soft cloth and a little ash paste. Under the paste the brass ones brightened warmly, not flashy but alert. The olive wood ones deepened in colour like bread crust after baking. One shell token caught the light and seemed to hold moon milk within it. Farid said shell had been used for the most delicate courtesies, because it reminded people to handle matters lightly. Alia asked whether the court once had lamps in the wall niches. Not in all of them, he said. Only 2 travelling lamps near the ledges and 1 on the weighing table. The wall niches held the trays and tokens. But if the court reopened properly, a pair of quiet lamps might serve again, especially in autumn when traders arrived after sunset. That afternoon, as if the town itself were listening, the coppersmith's son arrived with 2 repaired hanging lamps and 3 polished hooks wrapped in cloth. He claimed he had restored them from bits found in his father's store. Farid tested the hinges and pronounced them honourable. Alia spent the remaining daylight rubbing their glass chimneys until she could see her own eye reflected in them. When they returned to the court for the second full workday, they did not go alone. Hanan, the rope-braiding daughter of the rug mender, came to help tie reed screens between the trellis posts. Old Bashir joined them with 2 donkeys carrying folded mats, saying a route should not be revived on stories alone. The herb woman from the road, whose name turned out to be Amma Nawal, arrived with a basket of seedlings: mint, coriander, marjoram, and a creeping vine she believed might take kindly to the western trellis. The work party moved through the gate as if they had already done so for years. Alia loved that feeling most of all. The court no longer seemed like a discovered relic. It seemed like a task everyone already understood. Musa and Bashir set the new trellis poles and fixed the reed screens. Hanan tied the edges with striped cords so neatly that the knots looked like decoration. Sadaf arranged the cushions on the eastern ledges and immediately rearranged them because comfort, she said, should never be guessed only once. Amma Nawal cleared the herb strip by the wall and planted the seedlings where overflow from the well might later reach them. Alia and Farid worked inside the record room, brushing the shelves, pegging a line for hanging tally tags, and placing the recovered tokens in the 7 wall trays according to their proper order. On the weighing table, Farid laid the old ledger board, and beside it, a new packet of blank sheets from the paper seller. When Alia saw the old board and new paper side by side, she felt an inexplicable warmth. The court was not being turned into a museum of itself. It was being given back its next season. By midday, the western wall cast a pattern of trellis shade onto the chalk floor, and the whole yard altered at once. The reed screens softened the light. The ledges looked inviting. The herb bed released a faint green scent whenever the breeze passed. Farid decided it was time to clear the well platform fully, so Alia helped him scrub the stone with brush and water until worn grooves appeared where jars had once stood in orderly rows. Bashir repaired the animal trough lip and angled a tiny drain channel, so spills would run toward the herb strip instead of puddling at the gate. Hanan hung one of the restored lamps from the ledge beam, and another from a hook near the weighing table, though they did not light them yet. The record room door was rehung. Even Rami, who had been assigned the humble but necessary work of rinsing cups and fetching cloths, rose to the dignity of the task. In the hottest part of the afternoon, when work slowed and everyone sat in the trellis shade drinking watered mint syrup, Farid told them about the kinds of people who once passed here. Not only merchants, he said, but ink grinders, herb women, paper folders, cloth dyers, seal cutters, rope makers, and messengers carrying ledger corrections between larger towns. Forgotten trade routes, he explained, were often forgotten precisely because they served small, careful crafts rather than dramatic cargoes. Yet small, careful crafts held whole towns together. Alia looked around at the people in the yard: rope, herbs, cushions, lamps, ledgers, water, chalk, and understood that the court itself was made of many such small, careful things. Before dusk, Farid asked Alia to help him test the first evening arrangement. They placed the cleaned trade tokens in their trays. They set cups on the shelf, 3 upright and 3 inverted. They hung the 2 lamps and filled them modestly. Then Alia retraced in fresh chalk the boundary lines for the herb and paper rectangles, because those had worn most thinly. The chalk glowed bright against the darker plaster. When the sun dipped and the court entered its evening coolness, Farid lit only one lamp, the one by the western ledges. Its flame was low and soft. The reed screens caught the light and turned it honey-coloured. The chalk lines nearest the weighing table seemed once again to hold the dusk differently from the bare floor. It was not a loud glow. It was more like the moment after a page has been smoothed, and before the ink touches it, a readiness made visible. Bashir, seeing Alia watch the floor, said his grandmother had once claimed the old chalk carried groundshell in it, from the dye villages and powdered moonstone from the ridges, which he admitted sounded impossible even as he said it. Farid replied that impossible is often just a word people use when they have forgotten which practical hands made a thing. Everyone laughed softly at that. Then, because the evening had grown too lovely to abandon quickly, they remained long enough to drink one more round of tea in the court's first trellis-filtered lamplight. Their first guests arrived without being invited, which in Farid's opinion was the best kind of proof. They were a paper maker and his sister travelling from the northern mills toward the dye villages with 2 donkeys loaded in waxed cloth bundles. Seeing the fresh reed on the trellis and a lamp under the ledge, they turned in almost shyly, as if uncertain whether the place truly welcomed stopping. Farid rose from the weighing table at once and said the court was open for water and a cool hour. The paper-maker's sister placed both hands around her cup after the first drink, and sighed so deeply that Alia felt her own shoulders relax in answer. Their bundles, being fine paper, were carried into the dry rectangle marked on the chalk floor and laid exactly where the symbol said they should go. The correctness of this pleased Alia absurdly. It was as if the floor had been waiting many silent years to make sense again. The papermaker recognised the vine and balance seal in the record room at once, and said his grandfather had once received corrected tally slips from this court every harvest season. His sister added that the shorter road saved paper from the main square's bustle and dust, which made Farid look immensely satisfied. When dusk deepened, the travellers elected to sleep on the western ledge rather than push onward by moonlight, so the court hosted its first sleepers in many seasons, and Alia, though she returned home with her family that night, left feeling as if she had just heard the first notes of a long quiet instrument sound true again. After that, the court entered her life as steadily as dawn. Some days Alia spent only the late afternoon there, walking with Farid along the branch road carrying a basket of cups, oil, chalk, and a cloth bundle of bread. Other days, especially when her mother's work in the spice shop grew lighter, she stayed through evening and helped with the ledgers. Farid began teaching her the route marks used specifically for the Saffron Stair Road. A short vine dash after a village name meant delicate goods. A small dot in the corner of a storage box meant contents should be shaded, not stacked. A A crescent beside a count meant recheck by morning rather than immediately, allowing weary traders to sleep before disputing measures. He taught her how to place tokens back in the trays once goods were claimed, and how to ask simple, restful questions. Is your load dry? Does your animal need the outer trough or only a bucket? Will you depart before dawn prayer or after first bread? Do you prefer the ledge nearest the gate or the quietest corner? She discovered she liked this work. It was not noisy, and it allowed her to notice. One drover wanted his tea unsweetened and his ledger marks read aloud twice. An old herb woman preferred to place her baskets in the eastern rectangle, where the chalk floor kept a little coolness after sunset. A travelling cousin pair always stacked their sandals perfectly under the same shelf. The court gave such preferences room. Farid said that routes became beloved when they preserved people's specific tiredness kindly, rather than forcing everyone into one shape. The most soothing hour of all was just before the sky went fully dark. The lamps would be lit, the cups would be ready. The chalk lines would lie pale beneath the floor's shadow. If travellers had arrived, goods would already be placed in their marked spaces. If no one had yet come, the court itself seemed to sit expectantly, not lonely, simply ready. Alia loved walking the perimeter then. The herb strips smelled greener at night than by day. The vine-cutting Ama Nawal had planted took hold surprisingly fast and began to send soft leaves around one trellis post. The lamps hummed faintly when the flame settled. The record room, once dusty and closed, now held shelves of wrapped paper, spare chalk, folded cloth, and the olive wood seal resting like a dignified elder among them. Sometimes Alia stood at the gate and looked outward at the road under the first stars. It was never crowded. That was not the point. It carried those who chose a calmer branch. A line of donkeys loaded with tea bricks might appear, or a pair of girls escorting baskets of blue thread, or a quiet widower with wrapped packets of medicinal bark. Each arrival seemed to belong especially to the court because the court had been made for attentiveness rather than spectacle. In the middle of the early autumn, when the first saffron harvest began in the terraces east of Kea, Farid decided the branch route needed its outer signs restored as well, or else too many travellers might continue missing the turn. He and Alia spent 2 afternoons walking the road with a satchel of chalk wash, twine, and small strips of cloth dyed pale vine green by Sadaf's spice merchant neighbour. At each old marker stump they brushed away dust, recut faint grooves with Musa's careful knife, and tied a strip of cloth below the symbol so it moved softly in the breeze without looking festive. Alia repainted the cup sign for well ahead, the small rectangular mark for counting court, the paper fold symbol for dry storage, and the vine spiral that once indicated the shorter saffron branch. Farid said signs should be bright enough for the weary and modest enough not to insult the landscape. As they worked, he told her that forgotten trade routes did not disappear in a single year. They thinned. One keeper retired. One shelf remained dusty too long. One ledge lost its cushions. One season of crowded main roads passed, and people got used to convenience. Then, one day, a route was remembered only by Esselders and their shelves of tokens. Alia walked a while in silence after that, understanding more clearly than before how much of the world was held together not by monuments, but by repeated acts no one praised when done properly. News travelled along the branch road in return. A saffron grower said he would send his nephew by the quieter route once the first harvest bundles were tied. A paper trader from the north promised to use the court if his donkeys could avoid the bustle of the main square. A woman carrying dye cakes to a wedding village reported that beyond the southern rise she had heard of a bell house retended by a patient boy, and farther east of a roadside lamp niche restored near the old stone markers. Alia loved these stories, not because they were dramatic, but because they made the world of roads feel threaded. Somewhere, she thought, someone was trimming a bell strap while she wiped cups. Somewhere else a girl might be brushing dust from a basin floor while she retraced chalk lines. Farid listened to such reports with the mild satisfaction of a gardener hearing that distant seeds had taken root. Good customs travel lightly, he said again and again. That is why they survive when heavier things do not. As the saffron season advanced, the court prepared for its busiest nights. Sadaf began packing flatbreads in larger cloths. Musa brought a second low table for setting down bundles awaiting correction. The paper seller donated another packet of ledger sheets, wrapped against dust with blue linen ribbon. Hanan rewove 2 more reed panels for the western side where the late sun still pried in. Amanawal planted a second line of herbs and left instructions for watering them from cup rinse water rather than the well bucket itself, which Farid approved as the sort of modest wisdom that keeps places thriving. Alia took on a new task she adored, arranging the token trays in the correct order for evening service. First storage, then measure corrected, then cup returned, then well water, then animal water, then bed ledge, and last dawn departure. Farid explained that the sequence mattered because it mirrored the body's own needs across arrival and rest. Water, measure, seat, cup, sleep, morning clarity. Alia sometimes whispered the sequence to herself while sweeping, and it began to feel like a lullaby composed for traders instead of children. One night, on the eve of the heaviest saffron crossing, she and Farid stayed at the court after everyone else had gone back to Kea. The sky was cloudless, and the reed screens clicked faintly in the breeze. In the record room the shelves were full enough to look useful but not crowded. The two lamps glowed low. A single donkey from a passing tea merchant slept outside the wall, tied where the animal trough could be reached. Farid asked Alia to sit with him at the weighing table. From his sleeve he drew the brass weight shaped like a pomegranate and placed it in her hand. He said that when he was young, he had thought trade routes mattered, because they linked rare goods to eager buyers. Later, he learned they mattered because they let small places remain themselves while still speaking to one another. The saffron terraces did not become dye villages, nor the paper mills herb farms, nor Kea, a place of only one craft. Routes allowed each to remain particular without becoming isolated. The counting court, he said, had once been one of the quiet hinges in that arrangement. Alia rolled the pomegranate weight between her palms and looked at the chalk lines shining faintly beneath the lamp. She thought of saffron threads, blue dye, tea bricks, folded paper, rope, wax, herbs, cups, cushions and ledgers. None of them were grand alone. Together they made movement gentle. That seemed to her a more beautiful purpose than grandeur anyway. The great crossing came the next evening beneath a sky washed clear by a day wind. Word arrived first in the form of faint bells and donkey breaths, long before any figures appeared at the gate. Then the travellers came in patient succession. 2 saffron growers with cedar boxes lined in felt, a widowed aunt carrying herb bundles for a healer in the southwest, 3 brothers from the paper villages with rolled sheets wrapped against dust, a dye trader with careful blue-stained hands, and a couple transporting glass bead packets cushioned in wool. None brought noisy cargo, all brought things that rewarded care. The court received them as if it had always known they would arrive precisely then. Animals were watered. Boxes and bundles were set onto the proper chalk rectangles. Tokens were placed, traded, reclaimed. Farid sat at the weighing table while Alia, kneeling beside him, wrote the route marks he dictated on the fresh sheets. 2 cedar boxes, saffron stored dry, 5 wrapped rolls paper, transfer at dawn, 1 herb bundle, cool shelf, 4 bead packets, ledge side, no stacking, 1 blue dye crate corrected weight. Her writing was slow but clear, and every time Farid nodded she felt the nod in her chest like a lamp being adjusted brighter. Because the court was full, comfort had to be arranged with tact. Sadaf and Hanan, who had walked out from Kea carrying extra bread and blankets, settled the aunt on the ledge nearest the gate, where she could rise easily before dawn. The saffron growers preferred the western ledge because the evening air there stayed coolest. The paper brothers chose the eastern wall, where their bundles would be farthest from accidental damp. The bead-carrying couple sat a long while by the herb strip, breathing the marjoram and mint before finally lying down. Tea moved from hand to hand. Bread was torn. Small bowls of olives and chickpeas appeared. Rami, allowed once more to serve cups under strict supervision, behaved with such solemn concentration that even Farid smiled openly at him. When the lamps were lit and adjusted, the court took on its most beautiful self. The reed shadows lay across the chalk-vine pattern. The herb strip smelled softly of green things cooling after day. The ledgers, the weights, the tokens, the cups, the boxes, the bundles, and the tired faces all belonged exactly where they were. Alia thought that perhaps perfect order was not rigid at all. Perhaps it was simply the feeling of every object and body being given its rightful ease. Later, when the first conversations had thinned and only low voices remained, the gentlest magic of the court returned more clearly than ever before. Alia had gone to hang the dawn departure shell token in its tray when she noticed the chalk lines nearest the weighing table had grown not brighter exactly, but more present, as though moonlight beneath the floor had chosen to rise part way through them. The vine curls at the corners seemed to hold the lamp glow and release it slowly. The symbols pressed into the rectangles, jar, bale, packet, roll, stood out with a pale clarity they had not shown by day. She touched one line with her fingertip and felt the stone still warm from the afternoon, though the night air had cooled. Farid, seeing her pause, came to stand beside her. Without surprise, he said the court always liked a full evening of honest measure. Whether that meant old chalk remembering footsteps, shell powder reflecting moonlight, or something gentler still, he did not specify. Alia looked around. The travellers were resting. One of the saffron boxes had been left half open for air, and its scent rose warm and hay-like into the night. The dye trader's hands lay folded like sleeping birds on his blanket. A paper roll caught the lamp glow and shone softly at the edges. It seemed to Alia that the floor itself was pleased, not because goods had returned, but because their placing had once again been thoughtful and kind. She did not sleep deeply that night, and she did not mind. Several times she woke to little sounds that seemed part of one long, breathing body. A donkey shifting outside the wall, the tiny ring of a brass weight being lifted and set down by Farid as he checked one late arrival's correction, the dry click of a cup returning to the shelf, the reed screens touching their cords, a sigh from the western ledge, the faint stir of herb leaves beside the trough. Once she rose and found Farid in the record room rewrapping the unused ledger sheets so they would not drink night damp. He told her to go back to bed, but his voice held laughter beneath it. She lingered only long enough to see the olive wood seal on the shelf catching a little lamplight on its carved vine. When she lay down again on her own mat by the eastern ledge, she could see through half-lowered lashes the chalk lines crossing under the yard's shadow like pale water channels. The sight calmed her so fully that she felt the whole trade route extending outward from the court in gentle threads rather than hard lines. One toward saffron terraces, one toward paper mills, one toward dye courtyards, one back toward Chaos Square and the blue door of home. At dawn, the court moved into its morning sequence, which Alia would later decide she loved almost more than evening. Travellers rose in a hush thicker than sleep itself. Cups were filled. The first bundle ties were retightened. Tokens were returned to their trays one by one. The shell token for dawn departure was taken down and placed on the weighing table, while Farid checked that each note in the ledger matched what lay on the floor. Alia read aloud the marks she'd written the night before and corrected 2 numbers with his guidance. Not because there had been error, but because morning clarity deserved one last respectful pass. The saffron growers thanked the court aloud before lifting their cedar boxes. The paper brothers wrapped their rolls carefully and said the branch road had saved them a day's worth of square confusion. The herb aunt left a packet of dried mint for the shelf. The dye trader, after rinsing his hands, touched the chalk line of the dye rectangle lightly and smiled as if greeting an old acquaintance. Then the travellers went one by one through the gate, the donkeys rising with the soft, resigned nobility donkeys always possess, and the court began to empty. Yet it did not feel emptied. It felt completed. The ledgers held the impression of rest. The shelf held used cups awaiting washing. The ledger held the night clearly. The floor still shimmered faintly where dawn slid over the chalk. After everyone had gone, Farid did not sit immediately, though Alia knew his knees would have appreciated it. Instead, he asked for the broom. "Hospitality concludes with restoration," he said, echoing a principle he must have carried in many places. So they swept the faint straw, covered the cups, checked the well rope, watered the herb bed with rinse water, folded the extra blankets, and returned the tokens to their trays in full order. And only then did they sit on the eastern ledge with tea warmed over the little brazier. The road beyond the gate lay pale under early light. Farid looked more tired than usual, but also more settled, like a ledger line drawn straight after long uncertainty. He asked Alia what she thought the court still needed. She answered carefully. Perhaps one more lamp for the record room in cold weather, thicker cups for older hands, a second hook by the gate for hanging wet cloths, and perhaps a narrow bench outside the wall where late arrivals could sit before entering if the yard were already asleep. Farid listened without interrupting. When she finished, he nodded and said those were the thoughts of someone who had begun listening to a place instead of merely liking it. Ah, Alia smiled into her tea because that praise reached deeper than anything Shawia might have done. The season turned richer after that. Traders who had once overlooked the branch began choosing it deliberately. Not everyone, of course. The main road remained convenient and lively, and some goods preferred bustle. But those carrying delicate cargo, or those travelling with elders, children, herbs, paper, beads, ink, or simply a desire for calmer evenings, often turned at the restored markers and followed the green cloth signs toward the court of the vine measure. Khair adapted in answer. Sadaf's spice merchant began sending small sealed packets, labelled for the court shelf. Musa repaired more bag straps, for branch road use, as he began calling them. Hanan's rope found new purpose in trellis ties and well grips. Rami learned how to stack cups without chipping them and spoke of cup order with outrageous seriousness. The court itself changed subtly with repeated use. The vine on the western trellis thickened, the herb strip spread. The chalk lines needed regular retracing, which Alia came to find almost meditative. Her hand grew steady enough that the vine curls matched the old pattern more closely each week. Travellers began leaving tiny tokens of their own. A smooth bead on the record room shelf, a folded note of thanks, a sprig of dried thyme tucked beside the cups, a scrap of dyed thread tied to the outer marker cloths. None of these gifts were grand. All of them felt exactly right. One cool evening, as they sat beneath the reed shade waiting for the first arrivals, Farid opened the cedar token box he had long kept in his room and lifted from it a small weight Alia had never seen. It was made of polished bone and carved in the shape of a curled vine leaf. On its underside was scratched the balance beam and climbing stem from the old seal. He told her it had belonged to the court's apprentice counter long ago, when he himself was younger than she was now. The apprentice used it not for official weighing, but as a reminder weight kept in the hand. Count lightly before you count exactly. In practical terms, that meant noticing first what kind of tiredness, delicacy or urgency lay before you. A jar of herb oil was not a bale of wool. Folded paper was not tea brick. A trader carrying a fever cure did not need the same questions as a drover with salt. Farid closed Alia's fingers around the little bone weight and said it should be hers now, not as ornament, but as a tool for thought. She felt the smooth warmth of it in her palm and understood at once what he meant. A forgotten trade route was not restored merely by sweeping its yard and filling its well. It was restored by relearning the distinctions that had once made it merciful. By the time winter's first real coolness settled over the ridges, the court no longer needed introduction. Travellers in Khair asked, not whether the branch court was open, but whether the western trellis still held warmth after sunset, whether the ledge nearest the gate was free, whether the paper shelf remained dry, whether Alia or Farid would be present to correct a morning tally. This pleased Farid immensely, though he rarely said so directly. Alia could tell from the way he rewrapped the ledger at home each night, and from how often he paused at the gatepost when arriving, fingers resting a moment longer there than strictly necessary. One evening the papermaker and his sister returned, bringing with them a packet of fine pale pages cut smaller than usual. They said such pages were used for route notes that must travel folded inside sleeves. Farid accepted the gift and immediately assigned one sheet to Alia, so she could write her own guide to the court's evening sequence. She took the task seriously, drafting in neat lines. Draw water before first lamp, check cup shelf, set tokens, brush floor lines, confirm dry storage, ask travellers their morning hour, lower lamp by paper shelf after final tea, cover cups before sleep, return dawn shell token last. When she showed it to Farid, he smiled in the inward way she loved, and slipped the note into the ledger between old pages and new. The last warm night before true winter cold arrived, Alia and Farid remained at the court after a quiet evening with only 3 travellers, a messenger carrying rolled letters in oilskin, a widow with baskets of preserved figs, and a young rope seller who fell asleep while still thanking the ledge cushion aloud. The moon rose late, the lamps glowed steadily. The trellis vine, though leaf-thinned by season, still traced the western wall in soft shadows. When the travellers slept, Alia and Farid sat at the weighing table with their tea and listened to the court's mild noises. The herb strip smelled faintly silver in the cold. From the outer road came nothing but the occasional little ring of a halter clasp. Alia held the bone vine weight in one hand and looked across the chalk floor where the pale lines crossed and curled toward the central circle. She realised then that the court no longer felt like something rescued. It felt like something resumed. The difference mattered. Rescued things often remained fixed in the moment of recovery, admired for having survived. Resumed things continued their proper life. Farid seemed to sense the turn of her thought because he said, without preface, "A good route is not remembered when people praise it. It is remembered when they begin depending on it again." Alia stored those words where she stored all of his best ones. Later, after they had lowered one lamp and then the next, leaving only the ledge light for the sleepers, she stood once more at the gate. Beyond lay the branch road, pale under starlight, winding towards saffron fields, dye courtyards, paper rooms, and the blue-doored homes of towns that remained themselves while sending their careful goods into one another's hands. Behind her, within the wall, lay the well, the chalk vines, the ledger board, the cups, the token trays, the herb strip, the reed shade, and the quiet sleepers whose journeys had been eased for one more night. The whole route seemed to her then less like a line on land than like a chain of gestures. A shelf wiped clean, a weight checked twice, a cushion laid where an old knee would need it, a packet stored in the driest corner, a cup returned, a dawn token hung back in its tray. She drew a slow breath of cold, herb-scented air, and felt, with complete calm, that the forgotten trade route was forgotten no longer. Not because crowds had reclaimed it, and not because anyone had named it grand again, but because patient hands had restored its sequence, and once sequence returned, memory itself had somewhere proper to sleep and wake. Long after that season, people in care would speak of the court of the vine measure as if it had always been part of the living road and had merely taken a short nap. They would mention the chalk vines that seemed brighter on honest evenings, the cool well, the trellis shade, the neat ledges, the herb-scented water, and the clear young handwriting beginning to appear beside Farid's older lines in the ledger. Traders would choose the branch road because their paper stayed cleaner there, because their saffron rested more safely, because their elders slept better, because their goods were counted without hurry, because cups were always where thirst expected them to be. And when late walkers first saw the gate lamp after miles of pale road, their shoulders often lowered before they knew why, because some parts of the welcome reach the body earlier than the mind and teach it, very gently, to trust. And Alia, who had once only sorted tokens in her grandfather's room and wondered what old routes missed when no one walked them, would come to understand that the long journey across forgotten trade roads was never only about cargo. It was about the art of making exchange gentle enough that distance did not harden the heart. On the quietest nights, when the lamps were low and the chalk lines held a little moonlight of their own, she would sit by the weighing table with the bone vine weight in her palm and feel the whole sleeping road breathe beyond the gate, steady as a patient tide of footsteps moving kindly through the dark. Our second story begins as we leave the vine-shaded counting courts and follow a different forgotten road, one that climbs in pale steps along a chalk gorge where swallows turn like thrown ink strokes in the evening light, and folded maps once travelled more carefully than silk. We will walk beside a 13-year-old boy named Nader, whose hands are patient enough for paper, and whose eyes often notice the second thing in a room before most people have finished seeing the first. Beside him walks an old woman named Tahira, who is 76 and remembers roots the way some people remember lullabies, not in straight recitation, but in turns of shade, scents of stone, and the proper order of quiet tasks before sleep. Their story begins in the high town of Asmara, where penmakers shave reeds beneath slatted awnings, where letter carriers pause for mint tea before crossing the ridges, and where an old trade station called the House of Folded Maps has been sleeping above the gorge for so long that even the wind has begun whispering past it instead of through it. There will be chalk terraces, slate boards, drying racks, pale lamps, braided cords, water jars wrapped in wet cloth, and a kind of magic so gentle it feels almost like good organisation blessed by moonlight. If your own day has been crowded, let it grow lighter now. This road climbs slowly. Evening waits kindly, and this story is meant to settle around you like cool air in a shaded room. If you'd like to return to these quiet old roads again, you can softly subscribe, come back whenever the night feels long, and keep travelling with these gentle routes, resting houses, and patient keepers beneath the stars. Nadir lived in Asmara, a town built on terraces above a chalk gorge where the stone shone white at noon and violet by dusk. The houses there were narrow but deep, with flat roofs, lattice shutters, and little storage rooms kept cool with clay jars of water hung in the corners. In the mornings, the town sounded like shaving, brushing, and pouring. Reed was split for pens. Courtyard bricks were swept. Water ran from jar to basin in thin silver threads. Somewhere a donkey stamped. Somewhere else a woman beat folded cloth against a washstone with a rhythm so steady it felt like part of the architecture. Asmara was not famous for loud markets or grand walls. It was known instead for careful things. Reed pens cut to delicate points, lamp-black ink mixed with fig gum, stitched letter cases, ease-rolled paper kept dry on long journeys, sealing sand fine enough to save fresh script from blurring, and route notes copied in such clear hands that even tired traders trusted them at first glance. Nadir's father, Dawood, cut reeds and shaped pen shafts in a workshop that smelled of green stalks, knife shavings, and polished wood. His mother, Leila, mended the leather corners of document satchels and stitched padded wraps for fragile paper bundles. His younger sister, Mina, who was 9, liked to sort ribbons by shade and tell everyone the names she invented for them. Dusk blue, almond cream, smoke plum, moon silver, tea leaf, and fig bark. In the room above the courtyard stair lived Tahira, Dawood's mother, who had once copied route bulletins for traders on the gorge roads, and who still kept more folded maps, clipped notes, and tied bundles of old travel slips than anyone else in town. Tahira's room was one of Nadir's favourite places in all of Asmara, because it seemed made almost entirely of surfaces where memory could be set down without fuss. On one wall hung wooden rods from which cloth route strips were suspended by little brass clips. Some strips were plain, some embroidered with symbols, and some marked in tiny script that Nadir had only lately become good enough to read without help. Beneath the window stood a table with smooth hollows worn into it by years of slate rubbing and paper folding. A shallow chest held guide cords dyed in different colours for different kinds of road advice. Blue for good water, saffron for caravan passage, pale green for herb routes, grey for rockfall caution, white for cool night shelter, and rose-brown for slow animal passage through narrow turns. There were also reed cases, flat stones for grinding ink, weighted cords for keeping maps open in wind, and a small packet of silver hooks shaped like crescent moons. Tahira did not make show of these things. She treated them as a baker treated trays or a potter treated cloths, with respect made practical by use. When Nadir was younger, she let him polish the brass clips and sort the guide cords. Later, she taught him what made a route note trustworthy. It should be exact without being cold. It should say whether a spring ran low rather than calling it poor. It should note whether ledges slept warm after noon, or whether chalk steps crumbled under heavy loads. It should remember old travellers, children, widows, tired donkeys, and paper bundles equally. A forgotten road, she said, was often only a road no one had described kindly enough in recent memory. Nadir listened to Tahira whenever he could. He liked the steadiness of her teaching, and the way she never hurried toward the point, trusting the point to arrive with the work itself. Some afternoons she set a slate board between them, and had him copy route symbols until his wrist loosened, and his letters stopped leaning too eagerly forward. A triangle over a line meant terrace steps. 2 curls and a dot meant spring basin nearby. 3 short strokes under a square meant storage ledge shaded by morning rock. A little folded shape marked map shelter or copying room. Sometimes, after lessons, she told him how the gorge routes had once linked paper towns, seal cutters, ink grinders, herb dryers, and schools in ways the busier lower roads never quite had. Caravans of wool and salt preferred broad paths, but paper, ink, wax, fine cord, script copies, letters, stitched bindings, and delicate herb parcels often travelled the chalk gorge routes because they were cooler, drier, and more thoughtfully supplied. Travellers on those roads valued ledges, drying rooms, and copied notices more than loud square markets. Nadir loved this image of trade made not by shouting and bargaining, but by careful bundles, clean shelves, and accurate notes. It made him feel that gentleness could be industrious rather than merely quiet. The House of Folded Maps entered his life as many important places do, in the form of something small brought home in another person's hand. One late summer afternoon, as the light slanted gold through Dawood's reed shavings and Mina sorted ribbon ends into neat little nests, a travelling bookbinder named Iskandar arrived carrying a leather case whose clasp had snapped. He wanted Dawood to replace the fitting before he continued east. While Dawood examined the case, a flat brass object slipped from one side pocket and fell softly to the workshop bench. Nadir picked it up before it could slide beneath the reed basket. It was a map clip, heavier than the little clips Tahira used at home, and shaped like a wing folded over itself. On its face was stamped a stare of 7 short lines descending into a square. Tahira, hearing Iskandar's voice in the courtyard, came down the stair with the unhurried alertness Nadir knew meant memory had been touched. When she saw the clip in Nadir's hand, she stopped so suddenly that Mina nearly walked into her skirt. "The House of Folded Maps," she said before anyone else spoke. Iskandar blinked in surprise and admitted he had found the clip in a dusty tray on a terraced station above the White Tern Gorge. He had sheltered there at noon, not expecting much more than a partial shade, and found the place sound but sleeping, with slate boards on the walls and a room full of racks built for drying paper. No one in the last town had remembered its name. Tahira held out her hand for the clip. When he gave it to her, she pressed her thumb over the stamped steps and smiled in a way that made her look, all at once, less old and more exact. That evening she brought down 3 rolled maps, a slate note, and a cloth strip embroidered with 7 descending lines. On the courtyard mat she laid them in a row while the family gathered around with mint tea and warm sesame bread. Srastia explained that the House of Folded Maps had once stood on the upper ink stair, a high branch route crossing the gorge edge between Asmara and the western schools of copyists, then on toward herb terraces and 2 villages known for sealing wax and stitched document covers. The house had not been a caravan sarai in the grand sense. It was more specialised and, to Nadir, more beautiful for that. Travellers arrived there with fragile goods: paper, copied contracts, letters, school texts, dye samples, herb prescriptions, blank folios, wax, ribbon, ink cakes, seal moulds, and used the terraced rooms to air, dry, sort, or correct them. Slate walls in the entry terrace held fresh route notes. Map rods in the main room displayed cloth strips with conditions written in chalk wash or charcoal. One upper terrace was used for careful tea and quiet reading. Another held ledges for sleeping with document satchels tucked into wall niches. A cool rear room had racks for damp papers or freshly glued bindings. Because the route bent along chalk steps and cliff shadows, it stayed cooler than the lower road through most of summer. Because the house kept updated route notes, scholars, binders, letter carriers, and herb merchants had once trusted it deeply. Then the lower road was widened. A broad station opened at the gorge mouth. Copyists began travelling in larger groups by easier paths. The house was not ruined, Tahira said. It was merely outweighted. Nadir asked why she had never told him about it before. Tahira answered with characteristic honesty. Some places become difficult to speak about once you have stopped expecting them to return. She herself had copied notice strips for the House of Folded Maps in her youth, sitting in the outer room with a slate on her knees and a cup of tea cooling beside her, writing out fresh route conditions sent from both sides of the gorge. Later, when her husband died and Dawood's work tied the household more fully to Asmara, she no longer climbed that far as often. The younger keepers moved away. One season the lower road claimed most of the traffic. Another season dust gathered on the map rods longer than anyone intended. After that, people said they would restore it when there was time, which is one of the gentlest and most dangerous ways for a place to go to sleep. Iskandar listened with the grateful concentration of a man who had stumbled into the right story by accident. Dawood asked the question Nadir could almost feel rising in his own chest. If the house still stood, could it be used again? Tahira turned the map clip between her fingers and said that if the cistern still gathered night drip, if the slate walls were legible, and if the paper room had kept its roof, then yes. Not loudly, and not all at once, but yes. No one in the family mistook that answer for permission to rush. The next day passed in preparation rather than excitement, which Tahira always said was the soundest way to begin anything meant to last. Dawood selected tools for hinges, shelf pegs, and rods. Layli stitched 2 padded cloths for wrapping any papers or slate boards that might need carrying. Mina sorted guide cords and insisted the pale grey ones for cliff caution should be wrapped separately from the white ones for cool shelter, because as she rightly pointed out, tired hands make mistakes when colours are cluttered. Nadir gathered chalk, charcoal, 2 slate cloths, a brush of soft reeds, and a notebook. Tahira opened her shallow chest and took out 7 small brass clips, each with the folded wing shape of the map clip Iskandar had found. She polished them one by one until they caught the afternoon light like warm water. Then she chose 3 rods of plain wood and 1 with carved ends, saying that if the house still accepted rods for root strips, it should not be given only the plainest of replacements. That evening a bookseller neighbour sent a packet of miscut practice paper for note-taking. A schoolteacher contributed a box of old wax tablets. The apothecary's wife, hearing of the errand, sent dried rosemary and mint because paper houses, she said, ought to smell clear rather than stale. They left Asmara before sunrise 2 mornings later. The town still wore its blue shadow then, with only the bakery court awake enough to send real fragrance through the alleys. Nadir walked beside Tahira for the first stretch, while Dawood led the donkey bearing tools, folded cloths, jars, hooks, brushes, tea, bread, cucumbers, goat cheese, and a wrapped lamp from their own courtyard. Mina rode atop the rolled mats until the slope steepened. The path to the upper ink stair began behind the north cistern and climbed by terraces cut into the chalk. Here the gorge opened and narrowed by turns, showing pale walls streaked in cream, lilac, on grey where old water had once marked them. Swallows wheeled below and above, sometimes seeming level with the travellers, though the town roofs had already dropped behind them. The air smelled of stone, dry thyme, and the faint mineral cleanness that belongs only to cliffs before the full heat of day. Tahira set a measured pace and pointed out old root marks half hidden by dust, a carved folded square on a stone post, a shallow basin where paper porters once rested, an iron ring set in the wall for tying cautious animals while slippery packets were rearranged. Nadir wrote these down when they stopped. Mina, forbidden from leaning too far toward any scenic edge, compensated by naming every swallow she saw a different impossible title: Ink Tail, Cliff Arrow, Silver Wing, Chalk Kiss. Dawood only smiled and adjusted the load straps. At mid-morning they met 2 travellers descending, a teacher carrying wrapped bundles of school texts and a young woman transporting sealed herb packets in narrow basket trays. Both had chosen the lower road because they had heard nothing certain of the upper ink stair for years. Hearing Tahira's destination, the teacher pressed his palm to his heart and said the old map house had once saved his grandfather's manuscripts from damp during a summer storm. The herb woman said her aunt still preferred cliff roots because dust rose less heavily there, but she had grown old enough to dislike uncertainty about shelter. Tahira answered that uncertainty, if politely corrected, often turns back into trust faster than expected. The travellers smiled at this and asked them to send word to Asmara if the house truly woke again. Nadir liked the way news moved in such brief exchanges, never theatrical, always practical. It felt like passing cups from hand to hand. The house of folded maps revealed itself gradually. First came the outer retaining wall built into the cliff, then a stair of 5 broad chalk steps, then a low terrace shaded by a crumbling awning frame, and finally the entry room itself, nested into the gorge side with 2 upper terraces rising behind it like folded pages. The building was more vertical than Elia's counting court would have been, though Nadir had never seen that place and knew it only from road talk. Here the rooms clung to the cliff with a kind of modest intelligence. The lowest terrace held the entry wall and a slate board under a shallow roof. The middle terrace carried the map room and tea ledge. The upper terrace, and reached by side steps, contained the sleeping niches, and further back the cool paper room. A narrow channel ran along the rock face, built to collect night condensation, and rare trickles into a small covered cistern at the rear. Dust coated everything, but not in the heavy burial of abandonment. It lay in polite layers, as if the house had been waiting with better posture than most empty buildings managed. The outer slate boards still showed faint chalk ghosts beneath the dust. The awning poles leaned but had not fallen. Through the half-open door, Nadir glimpsed rods on the wall and a table at the centre of the map room. Above, one strip of old cloth still hung from a rod, stirring very slightly in the gorge breeze. Tahira did not speak for a while after they climbed the entry steps. She stood with one hand on the doorframe and the brass clip in her other palm, her eyes moving from slate to rod to terrace in a quiet, accurate way. At last she said, "It has slept respectfully." Nadir understood exactly what she meant. The place did not feel broken or sorrowful. It felt paused in the middle of a useful sentence. Dawood tested the door hinges, which answered in a dry murmur but did not resist. Inside, the map room smelled of chalk, old reed, and the faint must of paper long gone. Along one wall, the wooden rods remained in their brackets. Below them stood a broad table with shallow slots cut into its edge for holding weighted cords. Under the table were trays for clips and folded strips. On the opposite wall hung 3 slate panels framed in wood, each one veiled grey with dust but still sound. The upper terrace beyond the room held a ledge with built-in niches sized exactly for satchels or rolled texts. In the rear paper room, entered through a lower lintel, slatted drying racks stood one above another like bunk beds for pages. Nadir ran his fingers over the nearest slat and felt it remain straight beneath the dust. Mina discovered a shelf of small clay cups. Dawood found the cistern lid uncracked. Tahira walked to the slate panels and brushed one corner with her sleeve until a symbol appeared beneath. A little fold over 3 steps. The root mark lived there still. Work began with sweeping, though in a cliff house, sweeping meant listening as much as brushing. Dust on a paper table differed from dust in a sleeping niche. Chalk grit on slate asked gentler cloth than sandy silt on steps. Tahira assigned tasks accordingly. Dawood and Nadir cleared the lower terrace and stair, so safe footing returned first. Lala wiped the cups, ledges and satchel niches. Mina sorted the recovered clips and hooks into little rows on a cloth, speaking under her breath to keep count. Tahira herself approached the slate panels with damp cloth and soft reed brush, coaxing the old chalk ghosts upward without erasing what remained. Under her hands appeared headings, arrows, distance marks, and the faint outlines of route notices written by other hands long before Nadir's birth. On the central panel, one message lingered just clearly enough to read after much wiping. North Spring low in late heat. Carry cool cloth for papers. Another said simply, upper ledge warm after moonrise. Nadir loved these notes at once. They were so practical, so exact. So full of care for strangers he would never know. He imagined the writers pausing in this very room to leave behind comfort they would never witness again. The cistern mattered next. Dawood lifted the cover while Nadir held the rope, and Tahira listened to the echo. The water level had fallen low but not vanished. After a few draws and a careful skimming, they found the taste cool, chalk-light, and slightly sweeter than the town cisterns below. Tahira said cliff-drip water always seemed to carry patience in it. Along the rock face above the upper terrace, the collection channel remained visible beneath mossy dust. Mina, peering up with scandalous interest, shouted that droplets still clung there in the shade. That pleased everyone disproportionately. Lala washed the cup shelf, then arranged the cleaned cups beside a bowl of mint and rosemary leaves. Dawood reset 2 loose rack slats in the paper room and tightened a bracket near the rods. Nadir meanwhile wiped the table and discovered under the dust a board inlaid with narrow white lines not unlike ledger guides, though arranged differently. These formed rectangles for folding sizes: letter, ledger strip, route slip, satchel note, and broad map panel. He called Tahira to see. She laid her fingertips on the inlay and smiled very gently. "The folding board," she said. "A map house should never lose its folding board." Not all papers needed the same creases, and tired hands were saved trouble by good guides already waiting. By noon, the terraces had begun to breathe again. The lower slate board stood mostly clean. The rods had been dusted. The paper room smelled no longer musty, but dry and woody, like shelves in winter sun. Lala laid one of her padded cloths on the upper ledge. Mina threaded new guide cords through 2 brass clips. Tahira unwrapped the 7 polished clips from Asmara and set them on the table like a row of small warm birds. Nadir asked how the house had once used them. She explained that travellers on the upper ink stair did not rely only on slates. They also hung root strips from the rods, each strip marked with a current condition that could be seen at a glance, even by those too tired for full reading. A blue-tied strip might mean good water at the next terrace basin. Grey marked loose chalk under hoof. White meant cool upper ledge. Saffron could indicate a busy paper convoy on the route. Rose-brown signalled narrow passing on steps. Pale green told herb carriers that shade remained ahead. The rods created, in effect, a hanging weather of information. She said this without pride. To her, it was simply intelligent hospitality. Nadir stood looking at the bare rods, and imagined them once again dressed in quiet strips that moved in the cliff breeze and answered the road with clarity. After they ate bread, cucumbers, cheese and figs on the middle terrace, Tahira asked Nadir to help her search the upper storage alcove behind the sleeping ledge. Inside they found what seemed at first nothing more than collapsed cloth and cane. Yet beneath the cloth rested a shallow drawer unit with 3 drawers still sliding if coaxed. In the first drawer lay dried chalk tags, each pierced for hanging. In the second were folded cloth strips, stiff with dust but surprisingly sound. Some were plain, others had embroidered borders, dots, little folds, 3 steps, a cup, a crescent over a basin. In the third drawer lay 2 slate pencils, a packet of lampblack wrapped in waxed cloth, and a set of tiny lead weights used to keep maps from curling on the table. Nadir lifted one cloth strip and sneezed immediately, sending Mina into laughter from the doorway. Tahira took the strip and shook it once in the light. Beneath the dust, the fabric showed a pale, silvery blue. She said the house had kept its own strip stock here, ready for notices that needed to last longer than a day. Nadir held another strip, cream-coloured with a green stitched edge, and felt a strange affection for it. These were not precious in the way jewels were precious. They were precious in the way simple tools remain when skill has gone elsewhere for a while. The first afternoon passed in exactly that manner, with small recoveries changing the shape of the place. Dawood found a rack hook for hanging document satchels. Lale uncovered a little wall niche in the paper room where sealing sand tins had once been stored. Mina discovered a line of swallow feathers tucked above a beam, which Tahira declared a good sign because swallows prefer houses that behave calmly. On the outer slate board, once Nadir had wiped the last film away, the headings appeared in elegant if faded hand. West Descent, North Shelf, Asmara Steps, Water Notes, Night Shelter. Beneath each heading were remnants of erased chalk, proof that the board had been used and reused through many evenings. At Tahira's request, Nadir took a fresh chalk stick from his satchel and, in careful letters, rewrote only one heading where it had grown too faint. Water Notes. His hand trembled slightly but held true. When he stepped back, the word looked neither new nor old. It looked resumed. Tahira read it, nodded once, and said the house had now been addressed properly. They did not attempt to reopen it immediately. Instead, they gave it a first evening of orderly silence. One lamp from Asmara was hung in the map room. 2 cloth strips were shaken, folded again, and left on the table. The cups were stacked. A little sprig of mint from Lala's bundle was set in water beside the slate pencils. Nadir walked the terraces at dusk and was struck by how differently the gorge sounded once the rooms had been brushed awake. Instead of blank echoes, there were soft returns, cloth breathing against rod, cup on shelf, a lamp chimney settling, the tiny click of brass clip against wood, Tahira's cane tapping once on the stair edge. Even the outer board, now legible again, seemed to give the wind something to pass over more thoughtfully. When the first star appeared above the gorge lip, Tahira set the recovered folded wing clip on the map room table, and laid her palm over it. Nadir saw her do this, and understood, without being told that some forms of gratitude are best kept quiet. They returned to Asmara under moonrise, carrying with them only what needed real repair. 1 bent bracket, 2 loosened rods, and a packet of rack pegs. Everything else remained in place, as if the house had already been given enough promise for one day. News moved through the town by supper and was even more eagerly received than news of Alia's court might have been in another quarter of the world. The schoolteacher sent word that if the upper ink stair reopened, he would gladly direct manuscript carriers that way during dry weather. The wax seller offered 3 packets of sealing sand for the paper room niche. A letter runner promised to bring route observations from the western schools if the slate board stood ready again. A woman who stitched book spines brought a roll of narrow linen straps for tying map cases to terrace hooks. Even the little tea stall near the north cistern offered to keep a jar of rosemary and mint set aside specifically for the Cliff House. Nadir loved how no one said the house should become famous or busy. They said it should be ready, clear, dry and calm, and such words felt truer to him than praise would have been. For the next 3 days his family lived partly in Asmara and partly in preparation for the house above it. Dawood shaved replacement pegs and polished the straightest of the rods. Laleh washed the old cloth strips and laid them flat beneath weights so they would dry without curling. Mina sorted guide cords into tied loops, and then, at Tahira's instruction, learned which colours belonged beside which route symbols. Nadir practised copying short notices on slate until his hand could produce letters that looked restful rather than anxious. Tahira opened her chest and withdrew a bundle of old notice copies from her youth. On them Nadir read messages like, 2 donkeys may pass at North Shelf if loads are narrow. Cool ledge available beneath second awning. And binder travelling west requests no heavy dusting in paper room. Such notes seemed to him more intimate than letters and more tender than contracts. They were kindness distributed through information. On the 4th morning, when the rods had been reset and the washed strips folded cleanly, Tahira said the house had waited long enough for a second visit. This time they were joined by others. The schoolteacher came bearing a flat crate of miscut slate tablets that could serve for practice notices. The wax seller's daughter brought 2 little tins and a spoon. A young letter runner named Sammy carried a packet of the old route observations still tied in twine. Nadir liked him immediately because he moved quietly and smiled as if saving his energy for good reasons. A book-stitching widow named Beren climbed more slowly but carried a basket of fresh linen straps and 2 padded ledge cloths of her own making. The little procession ascending from Asmara looked, to Nadir, almost like a slender caravan of tasks rather than goods, which seemed appropriate for a map house. At the terraces everyone set to work without ceremony. Dawood refit the rods. Beren arranged the sleeping niches with ledge cloths. Sammy tested the satchel hooks with his own route bag and pronounced them sound. The teacher sorted the slate tablets into the drawer unit. Tahira and Nadir began restoring the hanging strip system. Blue cords were tied for water notes, white for shelter, grey for loose stone, green for herb shade, saffron for busy paper passage, rose brown for narrow steps. One by one, Dirsut washcloth strips were clipped and hung from the rods, blank for now but no longer absent. When the cliff breeze entered the room, they stirred in a line, as if the house had just taken its first deliberate breath. What delighted Nadir most that day was the slate work. With Tahira beside him, he copied the headings back onto the outer board in fresh chalk. West Descent, North Shelf, Asmara Steps, Water Notes, Night Shelter. On the inner panel he added, under her guidance, the first current notice, cistern cool and drinkable, draw gently. On a hanging strip he wrote, morning shade holds on middle terrace. The letters dried pale and neat. Sammy then contributed a note from his route packet. Small chalk crumble below second turn, step wide. Tahira had him copy it in his own hand on the grey-edged strip because route notices, she said, should keep the hand that witnessed them when possible. The teacher added that cool reading light remained after sunset in the middle room, which made everyone laugh softly because it was exactly the sort of detail a teacher would consider vital. Yet Tahira approved, and had Nadir copy that too. By late afternoon, the map room looked transformed. The rods carried useful messages. The slates spoke clearly again. The table held weighted strips, chalk and slate pencils ready to hand. The paper room shelves were dry and stocked with clean cloths. The sleeping ledge seemed prepared for modest company rather than memory alone. Their first true guests came before sunset. They were not dramatic travellers, only the sort of people a map house would most properly receive. A manuscript carrier with 2 wrapped text bundles, an herb merchant transporting pressed leaves in stitched paper sleeves, and a young school copyist on her way west with blank folios tied to a satchel. They had heard from the schoolteacher in Asmara that the upper ink stair might once again offer reliable pause. Seeing the slate notes and the softly moving strip messages, all 3 smiled with unmistakable relief. The manuscript carrier touched the outer board heading with 2 fingers before reading it, a gesture so respectful that Nadir felt absurdly proud. Their bundles were placed in the paper room, and on the dry ledge according to need. Tea was warmed, cups were set out. The herb merchant, catching the scent of mint and rosemary near the shelf, said the house already smelled clearer than many busy stations. Tahira replied that clear minds made clearer routes. Nadir noticed how naturally the house absorbed their presence. No noise, no confusion, no need to explain the purpose of every surface. The strips moved, the slates guided, the ledges received. It was as though the rooms had been holding themselves still until precisely this sort of evening arrived. That night Nadir slept on the upper terrace ledge, with the sky opening above the gorge and a narrow, brilliant ribbon of stars. He woke once to the sound of paper being gently shifted in the rear room, and once to the faint scratch of Sammy, who had lingered late with a route packet, writing a correction onto a slate tablet. Between those sounds lay a silence so comfortable it seemed woven. The lamps glowed low. The hanging strips stirred with every little turn of air and brushed one another with the softest cloth whisper. At some hour after moonrise he opened his eyes and saw that the blank portions of the slate board, still dusty enough to catch light, had taken on a pale sheen. Not brightness exactly, more an attentiveness. The chalk letters seemed calmer under moonlight than under day. The white-edged shelter strip held a silvery line where the breeze lifted it. Nadir almost rose to look more closely, but sleep held him softly where he lay. In the morning he would remember the sight not as spectacle, but as a feeling, that the house, once given back its proper messages, had begun conversing with the night again. Over the following weeks the House of Folded Maps settled into life with the same modest dignity that marked all good road places. It did not become crowded, it became dependable. Letter runners favoured it because the route notes saved them unnecessary descent and reclimb. Herb carriers liked the cool paper room. School copyists preferred the ledges because the terraces held quiet rather than market chatter. Binders appreciated the drying racks and the slate warnings about chalk crumble or damp dawn. Nadir spent as many late afternoons there as his parents allowed, sometimes with Tahira, sometimes with Sammy, sometimes with Mina, who developed a startling talent for spotting when guide cords were in the wrong order. He learned to ask arriving travellers what kind of materials they carried and how soon they needed to move again. He learned that fresh glue required more air than wax-sealed folios, that rolled paper preferred higher shelves, and that herb packets should never be set beside sealing wax in heat. And he learned to read a satchel by how carefully its owner lowered it. Above all, he learned that a forgotten trade route could be rebuilt out of information just as surely as out of walls and wells. A clear notice at the right turn spared an animal's breath. A cool ledge noted honestly saved a bundle of papers. A warning of narrow steps could turn fatigue from danger back into mere tiredness. As autumn deepened, other small recoveries emerged from the house, as if routine itself were drawing them out. In a drawer behind the slates, Mina found rolled wax cloths marked with tiny stitched symbols to cover bundles in dew weather. Behind a paper rack, Dawood discovered a collapsible rod for airing damp map cases. The wax seller's daughter noticed that one niche beside the stair was perfectly sized for a lamp protected from gusts. And soon a little lamp stood there every evening, its glow catching the chalk edges of the steps. Beren added 2 more padded ledge cloths because older backs, she said, deserve a little honour. Tahira, pleased by the house's increasing order, finally unwrapped a little bell-shaped paperweight of green glass she had not shown anyone before. It had once belonged to the map table, and was used for holding the corners of broad route sheets in wind. She let Nadir set it on the folding board himself. When the late sun touched it, the glass cast a soft green tint across the inlaid size guides, and for a moment the whole table looked like a shallow spring viewed through reeds. One evening, after a day of high wind on the outer ridges, A cloth dyer arrived from the west with her nephew and 3 baskets of indigo thread samples wrapped in wax paper. She had chosen the upper ink stair specifically because busy roads and blue samples did not belong together. Over tea she told Tahira that farther south a bell house now guided tired mule drivers across a middle route, and east of Care and Old Vine Counting Court had begun taking delicate goods again. Tahira listened, then looked around the map room with quiet satisfaction. Good customs travel lightly, she said. Nadir had heard her say that before, but now he understood it more fully. In one place a bell strap was replaced, in another chalk lines were retraced. Here, route strips were rehung. No one needed these places to become grand. They needed them to become trustworthy. That night he wrote on a spare practice sheet, only for himself. A road remembers itself fastest when it is useful again. He folded the note small and tucked it inside his notebook. As the house grew busier, the hanging strip system became more intricate, and Nadir adored this complexity. Not because it was difficult, but because it translated so many kinds of care into a glance. A blue strip clipped to the first rod and weighted at the bottom meant the next basin was full enough for animals. A shorter blue strip tucked behind it meant only cup water remained. A white strip hung wide announced cool ledges available. Folded white meant quiet room only. Grey with 1 knot marked loose stones for narrow-footed travellers. Grey with 2 knots warned those carrying broad loads to use the lower road. Green tide high indicated herb shade and dry air. Rose browns signalled slow crossing at the north shelf. Saffron meant school copyists or paper convoys occupied part of the route and would prefer gentler passing. Tahira delighted in teaching him these distinctions, and Mina insisted on memorising them as well, though she sometimes invented absurd new meanings just to make him laugh. One long dusk, as the gorge turned lavender and the strips moved like mild water plants, Nadir thought there was something beautiful about a room whose walls had learned how to speak in cloth without losing their quiet. The gentlest magic of the house revealed itself fully on the night of the first clear harvest moon. By then the route had seen enough use that its restored signs were no longer surprising, only welcome. That evening the terraces hosted a paper convoy of 2 brothers and their aunt, and a physician carrying herb prescriptions wrapped in skin-soft cloth, and a school messenger with blank folios for Western students. The slates were full but not crowded. The rods held 5 currant strips. Tea had been poured. The paper room breathed dry coolness over the stored bundles. When the moon finally lifted high enough to clear the gorge lip and pour into the map room doorway, it touched the hanging strips one after another. Nadir, standing by the table with the green glass weight in hand, saw each strip brighten briefly along its folded edge, exactly where the chalk or charcoal marks had been laid. Not blazing, not even enough that a hurried person outside the room would have noticed, but clear to those within. The slate letters seemed to steady under that light, and for a few breaths the route notes looked less written than remembered by the room itself. Tahira came to stand beside him and said, in the calm voice she used for obvious truths, "The house likes honest notices." She offered no explanation beyond that. None was needed. The physician, catching sight of the pale gleam on the white shelter strip, smiled into her tea, as if she had just been reassured by an old friend. Afterward, Tahira did not speak of moonlit strips as magic to anyone who had not seen them. She simply said the slates read beautifully in clear moonlight, which was true. Nadir understood her reason. Places that rely on work should never be burdened with marvel seekers. Better that those who come appreciate a dry shelf, a clear warning, a protected lamp, and a cool room for folios. Wonder if it arrived. Why should arrive among such things, not instead of them? Still, he noticed thereafter that the strips seemed especially alive on nights when the notices were exact and recently witnessed. A sloppy note never shone so clearly. A copied observation written without care remained merely writing. A true route sentence, north shelf shaded until second star, or lower steps dusty but safe for narrow loads, seemed somehow to settle into the cloth and wait kindly there. This did not make Nadir solemn. It made him more attentive. He sanded his chalk points smoother. He listened more carefully to arriving travellers. He asked exact questions. He wanted the house to like his notices too. The busiest night of the season came in late autumn when a run of clear weather encouraged schools, binders, and herb merchants alike to move their goods before winter. Damp made the lower road muddier. Word had spread that the House of Folded Maps was awake, accurate, and dry. By sunset, the terraces held more people and bundles than at any time since Tahira's youth. There were school folios tied in blue cloth, wax packets wrapped in felt, narrow boxes of sealing stamps, trays of dried lavender, rolled maps, stitched satchels, bundles of blank paper, herb jars padded in straw, and even 2 cages of messenger doves covered with light cloth to keep them calm. Yet the house never became frantic. That was its triumph. Nadir and Tahira worked at the slates. Sammy carried fresh route observations from descending travellers and copied them onto the proper panels. Mina sorted chords and brought weighted clips to the table. The Baron arranged sleeping ledges according to age, wake time, and noise tolerance. Dawood repaired a satchel strap and then another. Lale served tea in batches so the cups kept moving without clutter. The map room glowed softly. The paper room stayed cool. The strips on the rods shifted in order, and every traveller entering seemed to understand at once where to look, where to set things, and how to become less tired. At one point, near full dark, Nadir realised he was no longer thinking of the house as Tahira's memory. He was thinking from within its rhythm. A messenger arrived, breathless from the west shelf, with news that a little chalk scatter had widened near the third turn. Nadir did not wait to be told what to do. He took the grey strip, tied the proper knot, wrote the notice, and hung it beneath the west descent rod. Even moments later, a binder with broad loads entered, saw the strip, and chose to leave at dawn by the lower road instead. A school aunt requested the quietest ledge because her niece needed early sleep before examination copying. Mina had already left the relevant white strip half folded to show limited quiet shelter, and the ledge was ready. A physician asked where the driest niche stood for medicinal papers. Nadir led him without hesitation to the upper alcove shelf. Each choice settled into the next. The house, the travellers, the slates, the strips, the ledgers, the cups, the table, the rods, the people carrying tasks from one level to another, all moved in one low coherent pattern. He felt himself inside something both old and newly learned, and the feeling was so calm it almost resembled drifting. Late that night, after the last cup had been stacked and the doves slept with their heads turned backward beneath their wings, Tahira asked Nadir to bring her the old folded wing clip Iskandar had first returned to them. She set it on the table beside the green glass weight and the slate pencil. Then she opened the earliest of the new season's ledger packets, the one in which Nadir had begun recording notable evenings in brief. He had written entries such as first manuscript carrier slept dry, white strip held under moonlight, Baron says upper ledge best for stiff knees, teacher requests clearer dawn note on north shelf. Tahira had added only a few lines in her own older hand. Now she asked him to read the entries aloud. He did, while the lamplight moved over the page and the hanging strips whispered very softly on their rods. When he finished, she placed her palm over the paper and said the house had taken his hand into its own sequence. It was one of the deepest compliments he had ever received, and because it was Tahira who said it, he did not mistake it for flattery. He simply bowed his head a little, and felt warmth spread through him as gently as tea. In the days after the great clear-weather crossing, Tahira introduced a custom Nadir had never known the house once kept. On one late afternoon each week, just before the first lamp was lit, any traveller passing through could leave a practical route sentence on a scrap slip or slate tablet, and the keepers would decide whether it belonged on the hanging strips, the outer board, or only in the ledger packet for later seasons. She called this hour Note Noon, though by then the sun had usually begun leaning west. Nadir loved the ceremony of it. The table would be cleared of loose clips. Mina arranged the chords by colour. Sammy stacked slate tablets in a neat fan. Then travellers contributed their small exact observations. A spring basin tasted sweeter after the second ridge shade. A narrow chalk turn scraped broad baskets but not slim satchels. A resting hollow above the herb terraces kept cool enough for wax in the final hour before dusk. A teacher with a stiff ankle preferred the lower stair rest rather than the longer outer bend. None of these details sounded important in a crowded square, yet within the map house they became part of the route's soft intelligence. Tahira taught Nadir that receiving such notes required a second kind of accuracy beyond writing. One must judge whether the observation was temporary, seasonal, personal, or universal. A ledge cool for one thin traveller in late autumn might not suit a family in high summer. A warning needed witnesses or humility. A kindness that helped only one kind of body might still deserve recording if written honestly. Nader found that he liked these judgments as much as he liked the copying itself. It felt less like deciding who was right, and more like arranging cups so each thirst met the proper rim. Soon after, Sammy asked whether Nadir would walk the western shelf path with him, and verify a group of older notices before they were copied fresh. Tahira agreed at once, saying a route that depended only on memory would soon become decorative rather than useful. So one cool dawn, the two boys climbed above the map house carrying chalk wash, cloths, 2 white guide cords, and a packet of date paste wrapped in leaves. The western shelf path proved narrower than Nadir had imagined from written descriptions. It bent along the cliff in shelves of pale stone, no wider than 2 careful donkeys at a time, with little pockets scooped from the wall where loads could rest without blocking the passage. At the second turn they found the old mark Tahira had mentioned, a folded square carved above 3 descending lines, almost invisible beneath dust. Farther on lay a tiny basin in the shade where cliff seep gathered just enough water to cool cloth but not fill skins. Sammy knelt there, wet the corner of his scarf, and said this was exactly the kind of place a careless note could exaggerate. Good water? No. Useful coolness for paper or a fevered forehead? Certainly. Nader wrote the distinction in his notebook and felt quietly pleased by it. They also found a shelf niche perfect for leaving a small emergency cup and a post ring where broad loads should pause before meeting uphill traffic. By the time they returned to the map house, both boys were dusted white to the knees and hungry enough to tear bread before sitting. Yet the slates they wrote afterward were the clearest Nadir had ever helped produce, because each line had been walked, touched, and tested under morning air. A week later, the house offered another gift from its sleeping years. While Dawood repaired the outer awning and Beren beat winter dust from the ledge cloths, Mina called from the upper terrace that something was knocking softly behind the niche wall whenever the breeze turned. Tahira and Nadir followed the sound and discovered, beyond a loose backing board near the sleeping ledges, there's a narrow storage slot running deeper than anyone had guessed. Inside rested 3 rolled wax cloths, a bone stylus, a packet of dried lavender gone nearly scentless with time, and, most precious of all, a slim route book wrapped in blue linen. Its pages were thick. Not paper, but treated cloth sheets meant for repeated folding and handling in dusty weather. The entries inside were unlike the ledgers in Tahira's room, or the nightly notes in the new packet. These were light guides. Morning light at North Shelf after third swallow turn. Best reading ledge after sunset on Middle Terrace. Moon reaches outer board in clear weather, when lower station bells go quiet. Paper room driest after wind from east. Nadir read each line with growing delight. Someone long ago had understood that people carrying texts, letters, and maps needed not just shelter and warning, but good light at the correct hour. Tahira said the route book must have belonged to a keeper, attentive enough to know that readers travelled with their eyes as much as merchants did with their feet. That same evening she had Nadir add a new heading to the inner slate, Reading Light. The first note he wrote beneath it said simply, Middle Terrace soft and steady after sunset. He liked knowing that a house could care for seeing as carefully as for sleeping. The restored heading proved useful sooner than expected. A group of Western schoolgirls arrived 3 evenings later with rolled copy sheets and wax tablets tied in blue cloth. They were travelling toward Asmara for winter lessons, and had chosen the upper ink stair because their teacher remembered that the old map house once kept better reading light than the lower station near the gorge mouth. By then the new reading light heading stood clear on the slate, and the girls smiled when they saw it as if greeted personally. Layla laid extra cloths on the middle terrace ledge, and Beren produced an old square cushion that made even chalk seem forgiving. After tea the girls spread their copy sheets, and, using the green glass weight, and Tahira's little lead pieces, read aloud to one another in voices so soft that their recitation blended with the breeze. Nadir sat near the door trimming chalk points and discovered that hearing written lines spoken within a house, built to protect paper, changed the whole room. The rods with their hanging strips no longer felt like storage or signage alone. They felt like part of a conversation between roads and readers. One of the girls, noticing the route symbols stitched on a folded strip, asked Mina what they meant. Mina, entirely pleased with herself, explained the white and grey chords in tones of immense authority. By the time the girls slept, each one had memorised at least 3 symbols and declared the house kinder than any place with only benches and walls. Tahira, listening from the ledge, later told Nadir that this was exactly how forgotten trade routes returned. Not by reclaiming old grandeur, but by proving to new travellers that old intelligence still fit their needs. The house also began to serve in ways none of them had predicted, but which, afterward, seemed inevitable. One particularly dry afternoon, a messenger from the Western Herb Terraces arrived with a bundle of physician copies that had been brushed by unexpected dust after a mule stumbled on the lower road. The papers were not ruined, only faintly filmed, but the physician's neat instructions needed cleaning and airing before further travel. In a busier station, the bundle might have sat in confusion among wool, salt or grain, until someone found a cloth and guessed. At the house of folded maps, the response seemed built into the walls. The packet went straight to the paper room. The drying rack nearest the inner curtain was cleared. A bowl of clean water and 2 soft cloths appeared. The messenger drank tea while Tahira showed Nadir how to hold each sheet by the corners, lift a dust with a dry sweep rather than a wet stroke, and let the room's cool current do more work than the hand. They spent almost an hour over those copies, and neither of them minded. When the physician himself arrived at dusk, having followed anxiously behind, he found the pages resting flat and calm, their writing safe. He took Tahira's hands in both of his, and said he had forgotten houses like this still existed. She corrected him gently. Not forgotten, she said, only waiting for their tasks to be remembered. Nadir kept that sentence as carefully as any route sign. As winter approached more closely, the people of Asmara began sending little practical offerings to the map house without needing to be asked. The reed seller delivered a bundle of finer cut slats for replacing any paper rack that tired. The baker's wife, sent cloth bags of toasted seeds because quiet terraces invited slower hunger than busy markets did. The apothecary prepared a small pot of salve for cracked chalk-dry fingers, for those who copy too long, as she put it. A widow who rarely left her lower lane brought 2 wool wraps and said they belonged on the upper ledges, where old bones noticed cliff colds sooner than young ones. Most touching of all to Nadir were the notes. Travellers, schoolchildren, readers, herb women, and even passing drovers began leaving brief folded scraps by the inner slate or under the green glass weight. Shade held long on East Turn today. A child slept well by the middle wall. Tea tastes sweeter after the upper steps. Please warn broad loads of chalk scattered near basin shelf. Some were useful immediately. Some belonged only in the ledger packet. Some were too personal for public slates, yet too kind to discard. Tahira taught Nadir how to sort them at day's end into 3 bundles, now, later, and memory. He loved that 3rd bundle most. Not every act of care needed to become instruction. Some deserved simply to remain as proof that the road had been walked tenderly. By the heart of the season, the House of Folded Maps had become not only a station of passage, but a small school of route courtesy. On certain calm afternoons before the first travellers arrived, Tahira allowed Mina and 2 or 3 other children from Asmara to sit on the lower terrace with miscut slate tablets and practice the old symbols. Nadir showed them how not to crowd the strokes, how to leave room between warning and reassurance, and how to wipe a board fully before rewriting so that old information would not haunt new guidance. The children took these lessons very seriously for at least 10 minutes at a time, which Tahira said was more than enough for a beginning. Sometimes a passing traveller would pause to watch and then add a simple lesson of their own. A binder might show how to wrap a map against damp. A letter runner might explain why broad loads should never ignore grey knots on the shelf strip. A teacher might demonstrate how moonlight changes reading distance on pale slates. Nadir adored these afternoons. They made the house feel less like a relic revived for specialists and more like a living branch of the town's own intelligence. Once, as the children copied folded square symbols in their awkward, careful hands, A breeze came through the rods and set the older root strips whispering above them. The sound was so gentle that the children all looked up together. Tahira only smiled and said the house liked hearing its language practiced again. Winter announced itself in the gorge with colder dawns, clearer stars, and a tightening sharpness in the cliff air after sunset. The house of folded maps adapted without complaint. Heavier ledge cloths were added. Lamps were trimmed lower so the rooms held warmth rather than glare. The paper room gained a hanging wool curtain at the inner side stitched by Layla to keep night chill from surprising stored bundles. The herb strip in a sunny corner slowed but did not die. The cistern water grew almost sweetly cold. Travellers arrived wrapped more deeply, and tea became as necessary as root notes. Nadir found he loved the house even more in winter. Its terraces seemed to gather warmth with greater intention. The slates read sharper in cold weather. Breath rose pale in the map room and disappeared by the rods. The hanging strips moved less often, so when they stirred, the room noticed. On especially clear nights, moonlight made the chalked headings look as if written on stone from inside rather than laid on top. It was a season for steady hands and smaller sounds, which suited him perfectly. By then, even those in Asmara who seldom left the lower streets spoke of the house as if it had simply re-entered its rightful work. A mother might say her daughter's copybooks arrived uncreased because they took the upper ink stair. A wax trader might mention that the cliff house kept his moulds cooler than the lower station. Letter carriers praised the clarity of the slates. School children heard of the hanging strip language and demanded demonstrations in the square, which Mina delivered with outrageous self-importance, whenever given the chance. The little tea stall by the north cistern began hanging a white cord on mornings when the upper ledges still held good shelter. Even the swallow watchers said the house sounded different now, as if cloth and board gave the gorge back a more interesting echo. Nadir knew all this was only another way of saying the same thing. People had begun depending on the forgotten route again. Not all of them, not always, but enough that the path no longer slept in memory alone. On the last mild evening before the winter winds turned truly narrow and cold, Nadir and Tahira climbed to the house alone. No guests had yet arrived. The gorge lay silver under early moonrise, and the terraces seemed to float between chalk and sky. They lit one lamp in the map room and one by the sleeping ledge. Then Tahira unrolled a broad cloth map at the table and weighted its corners with the green glass and 3 little lead pieces. The roads on the cloth were stitched in pale thread, with folded marks at shelters and stair signs at cliff passages. She showed him how the upper ink stair connected not only Azamara and the western schools, but little side branches to herb plots, a wax village, 2 seal workshops, and a cold spring shelf where paper carriers once paused at noon. The map, like the house, was not grand. It was exact. After a time, Tahira placed the folded wing brass clip in Nadir's hand. "Keep it for this season," she said, "not as an ornament. As a reminder that what must be held flat in wind must also be held lightly." He understood at once that she meant more than maps. They drank tea there in the quiet before travellers came, listening to the lamp and the mild cliff air. Nadir looked from map to rods, from rods to slates, from slates to the steps beyond the doorway. He thought of how a route could disappear by thinning into inconvenience and return by being made thoughtful again. He thought of the first brass clip on the workshop bench, the dust on the rods, the pale headings on the slate, the wash strips, the cistern, the paper room, the moonlit notes, the evenings of accurate warnings and quiet tea. Most of all, he thought of the people the house served, not grand merchants, but binders, teachers, letter runners, physicians, copyists, wax sellers, and travellers whose bundles needed dryness more than applause. Forgotten trade routes, he realised, were often the routes of delicate work. They were forgotten not because they mattered less, but because their goods and customs were quieter. Yet quiet goods also deserved exact shelter. Quiet travellers also deserved reliable notes. Quiet houses also deserved waking. Before the first guests of that evening climbed the steps, Tahira asked him one last question. "What do you think the house gives besides shelter?" Nadir looked around the room once more. The answer came slowly but clearly. "It gives confidence without forcing it," he said. "It lets tired people stop guessing." Tahira smiled in the way she did when a sentence landed well enough to stand on its own. Then they heard footsteps below, 2 measured adults, 1 lighter child, and the gentle clink of a satchel buckle. Nadir rose, adjusted the white shelter strip, checked the blue water note, and moved toward the doorway before he even realized he had done so. Outside, the gorge breathed cold, clear air along the steps. Inside, the lamps waited, the slates spoke plainly, the rods held their little language of cloth, and the old house of folded maps stood once more inside its proper work, welcoming another quiet evening on a route the world had nearly forgotten until patient hands taught it how to be remembered again. Later, after the house had filled with low voices and folded bundles and the moon had touched the strip edges pale, Mas and Nadir would sit by the map table with the brass clip warm in his palm and feel the long-forgotten trade route stretching beyond the terraces, like a careful thought carried from town to town. He would understand then, as fully as a 13-year-old ever could, that the long journey across old trade roads was never only about movement of goods. It was also about the movement of trust, clarity and rest, passed forward through cups, slates, strips, dry shelves, and quietly accurate hands until even the sleeping parts of the world remembered how to open their eyes. Our third story begins with leaving the chalk stairs and counting courts behind, drifting into a softer country, where trade once moved not over stone roads or desert tracks, but through channels of still water between tall reeds, floating gardens, low wooden jetties, and houses built on pilings that listened all night to the patient lap of the marsh. This is a different forgotten route, gentler in its silence and slower in its memory. A route where the important things were not speed or noise, but depth, weather, knots, lantern light, and the kindness of people who knew how to guide a loaded boat through mist without waking the birds. We will follow a 13-year-old girl named Samira, whose fingers are steady enough for thread, rope, and reed work, and an 81-year-old woman named Nawal, who can still read tide marks. Moon ripples and the old language of trading knots as if they had never fallen out of use. If you'd like to keep travelling these quiet, forgotten routes with me, you can softly subscribe, return whenever the night feels long, and rest again beside old roads, dim lanterns, and patient hands beneath the stars. Samira lived in a water town called Nizra, where the world never seemed entirely still, and yet never felt hurried. The houses stood on short, dark pilings above the marsh edge, with ladders descending to skiffs, and narrow plank walks tied one household to the next. In the early morning the channels were silver and pale blue, and in the evening they became long bands of bronze, lavender and soft green, depending on how the reeds leaned and what the sky decided to place inside the water. Samira's father, Harun, Nizastis made glazed storage jars that kept tea leaves crisp, figs dry, lentils sweet, and cardamom protected from damp air. Her mother, Iman, repaired sailcloth and stitched waterproof covers for cargo bundles. Her younger brother, Fadi, sorted shells, cork floats and small hooks into orderly trays, not because anyone asked him to do it, but because he liked the feeling of putting the world into quiet groups. Samira herself had a gift that nobody in the family could ignore. She understood how things should be tied. Give her a tangled cord, a fraying basket handle, a loose reed mat or a boat line slick from use, and before long it would be in her hands, then under her fingers, then transformed into something reliable. Nizra had once been busier than it was in Samira's childhood. Elderly people said this without sadness, the way one might say that mulberries are sweetest in the first warm week, or that winter geese arrive later now than they once did. They said it simply because it was true. In earlier years, shallow cargo boats had come from the southern reed lakes with rolled carpets, waxed paper, blue glass beads, soap blocks stamped with mint leaves, dried apricots, cumin, lamp oil, wool, and bundles of dyed thread. Other boats had come down from the northern inlets with notebooks, copper pans, tea bricks, pomegranate molasses, almonds, salt, and baskets of figs cushioned with straw. Nizra had been one of the places where goods paused, not for long, just long enough for water jars to be filled, ropes checked, ledgers amended, sails mended, and small meals eaten beneath reed awnings while birds paced along the shallows. Then the boats would move on again through a chain of water roads whose names had grown faint with time. Moon Channel, Heron Bend, Lantern Reach, the Reed Mirror Passage, and one especially quiet stopping place known as the Landing of 7 Knots. By the time Samira was born, most of those names lived only in the speech of old people, and in the habits of those who still looked at the water carefully. A drier decade had shifted channels. A wider road had been built far to the west, where carts could roll in all seasons and merchants with bigger loads preferred wheels to hulls. Then, year by year, the smaller marsh route had thinned. Some jetties sagged. Some guide poles rotted. Some little tide houses lost their roofs. Boats still moved, but fewer of them, and with less certainty. In summer, fishermen used the channels they knew, and in winter, people kept close to home. The grandmothers of Nisra remembered when each bend had a sound, a signal, a keeper, or a lantern arrangement. Samira's generation knew instead which places were best for cutting water reeds, where the herons nested, and where to gather smooth mud for patching pottery kilns. The trade route had not disappeared entirely. It had simply gone quiet enough that many people thought of it as memory rather than path. In the room at the back of Samira's house, where the jars cooled before glazing and the air always smelled faintly of wet clay, lived her great-aunt Nawal. She was Hurren's father's sister, small-boned and straight-backed despite her age, with wrists as thin as reed stems and eyes that missed very little. She had once spent so many years on boats that people still said she stepped onto dry ground as if listening for its depth. In Samira's earliest memories, Nawal was always sorting something. Shell markers in one tray, knots in another, polished driftwood pegs in a jar, folded scraps of waxed cloth stacked by size, little brass clips wrapped in lint-free cotton, and bundles of root cords tied with labels written in a narrow, slanting hand. Nawal had not been rich, and she had not owned shops or warehouses, but she had once performed a task more valuable than many people understood. She had been one of the last tide readers and route keepers of the eastern marsh channels. She remembered how deep the water should be at Moon Channel after 3 nights of north wind. She remembered which reed beds hid submerged routes, which docks took bigger barges, which bends echoed, and which channels turned dangerous only when the air grew too hot by noon. Most of all, she remembered knots. The marsh traders had once used a practical system that suited water better than ink. At important landings and rest houses, cords hung from poles or from covered boards. The number of knots, the spacing between them, the colours of thread wound near the ends, the direction in which certain loops lay, all of it meant something. One knot placed high with blue thread might mean enough depth for loaded passage. 3 short knots near the middle could mean drift reeds ahead. A loose loop with white wrap might signal shelter and clean water. Red did not mean danger in the harsh sense. It usually meant care, delay, or shallow approach. Children in Nisra no longer learned the full code, because by then few people needed it. But Samira liked to sit beside Nawal on warm evenings and watch her fingers move through those old cords, as if she were reading a script softer than letters. One late afternoon at the end of the mulberry season, when the light became thick and golden and the marsh gnats had not yet decided whether to rise, Samira and Fadi were helping unload a fisherman's catch at the lower plank walk, when they found the thing that changed the summer. It had been caught beneath a bundle of eel grass tangled against the side of a skiff. At first, Samira thought it was driftwood, because it was narrow and worn smooth by water. But when she lifted it free, she saw that it was shaped with intention, a strip of dark cedar as long as her forearm, notched 7 times along one edge. Through each notch ran the remnant of a cord, most of them snapped, one still intact. The surviving cord was wrapped near the end with faded green thread. On the flat face of the wood, someone had carved a heron standing between 2 wavy lines. The carving had softened with time, but it was still visible when the light touched it sideways. Samira felt at once that the object belonged to Nawal's world, and not to the ordinary drift of theirs. Nawal was seated by the back window when Samira brought the cedar board to her. She took it in both hands without speaking, which itself was unusual, because Nawal generally had some practical remark ready for every object under the sun. She turned the board over. She rubbed the notch edges with her thumb. She held the heron carving close to her face, then farther away, then at an angle. For so long she said nothing that Samira began to worry the thing might be broken in a way too sad to name. At last, Nawal let out one small breath through her nose, a breath that held surprise, affection, and something like recognition. "This," she said, "belonged to the landing of 7 knots." Harun looked up from a shelf of cooling jars. Iman stopped trimming sail patches. Even Fadi, who generally grew restless when adults entered memory, remained near the doorway. The room became very still in a pleasant listening way. Samira sat cross-legged on the mat at Nawal's feet. "What was the landing of 7 knots?" she asked, though she had already begun guessing from the board's shape and the old woman's tone that it had been more than a dock. Nawal rested the cedar strip on her knees. "A stopping place on the Reed Mirror Passage," she said. "Not the biggest one, not the busiest either. That was why I loved it. Big trade houses attract noise. The landing of 7 knots attracted people who preferred care. Paper merchants used it, tea carriers, glass bead traders, soap makers, families travelling with fragile things. It had a covered jetty, a tide board, a low house for kettles and ledgers, an upper drying rail for damp cloth, and 7 main signal cords hanging under the eastern awning. Those 7 cords were changed every day by a keeper who understood depth, wind, loading, and weather. A well-placed knot could save an entire boat from grounding. A missing knot could lose a week." "What happened to it?" Samira asked. Nawal smiled in the way old people do when the true answer has too many layers for one sentence. "The route shifted, then quieted. People preferred the West Road. One hard flood season loosened the lower pilings. A roof beam broke. The keeper's son married into a town farther north. Then there were fewer boats and fewer reasons for a family to stay there year-round. Places disappear very gently when each season takes only one useful thing away." That evening, after supper, when the bowls had been washed and the marsh darkened into long indigo bands between the houses, Nawal asked Harun to bring down a chest from the upper shelf in the back room. It was a narrow chest of lacquered poplar bound with copper strips gone brown with age. Samira had seen it often, and never once watched it being opened. Nawal kept the key on a cord inside her sleeve. When the lid rose, a dry layered smell came out like paper, old cloth, cedar oil, Hawaii, and the faint sweetness of time itself. Inside were bundles of signal cords wrapped in waxed fabric, tablets of smooth wood with the route names written on them, folded reed paper maps, a brass oil spoon, and a bell no larger than an apricot with a clapper made of dark polished seed. Nawal drew out a packet tied with pale thread and placed it on the mat. Within the packet lay a rolled map, not grand, not illuminated, not meant for admiration. It was practical and plain, its lines drawn in brown and blue, its notes written in the same narrow hand seen on the labels. When she unrolled it carefully under a clay weight, Samira saw the water world of Nizra spread before her, but older, busier, denser with names. There was Moon Channel, there was Heron Bend, there was Lantern Reach, and there, east of a broad patch marked Silver Reeds, there was the landing of 7 knots. It was farther than Samira expected, and yet not impossibly far. Not hidden at the end of the world, not sunk beneath myth, simply beyond the channels most people in Nizra now used. Nawal traced the route with one finger. "When I was younger," she said, "boats coming up from the southern shallows often rested here before crossing toward the northern inlets. It was good for fragile cargo because the water stayed calmer near the landing. The keeper knew when to tell people to wait, and traders who listened arrived with whole goods instead of broken ones. Some routes survive on speed, others survive on trust." She touched the cedar signal board. This must have torn away in some old storm or flood and wandered until it chose to return. Nobody in the room argued with that. Marsh people were practical, but they knew that water had its own ways of delivering messages. The next morning, Samira expected the matter to become another cherished story added to Nawal's store of them. But after breakfast, Nawal folded the map, wrapped the signal board, and said to Harun in the same tone she might use to request more lamp oil, "We should go and see what remains." Harun blinked once. He had Nawal's patience, though not her exact habits. "See what remains," he repeated. "Yes." Iman set down her needle. "This week?" If we wait until next week, we will still be older and the landing will still be waiting. Harun smiled at that. He knew better than most people that when Nawal spoke with such flat calm, resistance was wasted effort. Then we'll need the broad skiff, he said, and 2 extra poles. If the side channels have silted. 3, Nawal replied. The eastern crossing drifts shallow in hot weather. Samira tried not to lean forward too visibly, but the hope in her chest felt like a lamp being lit. Iman noticed, of course. Mothers always noticed. You may come, she said before Samira could ask, if you promise to listen before moving your feet, hands, or opinions. I promise all 3, Samira said. Fadi immediately announced that he would come as well, which led to a family discussion of depth, insects, patience, weather, sun hats, and the very real difference between wanting to go somewhere and being useful there. In the end, it was agreed that Fadi would remain in Nisra with neighbour cousins, Sujus because he was too likely to lean over edges in moments of excitement, and because someone had to feed the clay kiln in Harun's absence. Samira was secretly pleased. She loved her brother, but the journey felt like something delicate, the sort of task that wanted fewer voices and steadier movements. Preparation for the trip took the rest of the morning and half the afternoon, and Samira loved every minute of it. Harun inspected the broad skiff, rubbing fresh oil into the oarlocks and checking the seam caulking. Iman packed flatbread, sesame cakes, mint leaves, tea, soft cheese wrapped in vine leaf, dates, dried figs, and a little jar of preserved lemon for brightness. She added sewing tools, sail patches, spare cord, 2 waxed cloths, and 1 roll of heavy thread strong enough for awning repair. Samira gathered brooms, hand brushes, reed knives, cloths, and a wooden box containing pegs, chalk, a small hammer, and her favourite short-bladed knife for trimming cord. Nawal contributed the items nobody else would have thought to bring. Fresh signal line, 6 bundles of coloured wrapping thread, a tide stick marked in finger widths, the little bell from the chest, a ledger book with blank pages, a lidded tin of cedar oil, and a packet of 7 small polished weights used for straightening hanging cords. Before they left, she stood for a long time beside the skiff, looking over the supplies as if she were not counting objects but listening for omissions. At last she nodded once. Enough to begin, she said. They pushed away from Nisra in the late afternoon when the heat had thinned and the marsh wind moved in thoughtful strokes across the water. The broad skiff slid between reeds taller than Samira's father, their feathery tops whispering overhead like low conversation in another room. Samira sat near the bow with a pole and tried to remember every instruction she'd ever heard about water travel. Do not assume a bright patch is shallow. Do not assume dark water is deep. Watch how the reed roots behave. If the ripples change shape, the bottom is changing too. If birds stand where you expect drift, the current has shifted. Nawal sat behind her, one hand on the skiff edge. Her face turned not toward the obvious route, but toward the little signs along it. The slant of floating leaves, the drifting of foam, the direction taken by gnats, the angle at which the light lay across the channels. Harun rowed where rowing was useful and poled where rowing was not. Behind him, Iman kept their bundles in order and occasionally pointed out reed beds suitable for cutting later in the season. All of it felt purposeful, calm, and so completely unlike ordinary errands that Samira wished the afternoon would stretch twice its length. The known channels gave way gradually to lesser used ones. The water narrowed. The reeds pressed closer. Sometimes a fallen stem crossed the way, and Harun lifted it aside with the pole. Sometimes a patch of duckweed made the channel look solid, until the skiff entered and left behind a wide dark seam. Once they passed the remains of an old guide stake, barely more than a stump rising from the water at a slant, its top worn flat by years of weather. Nawal tapped Samira's shoulder and pointed. There, she said. That used to carry a white cord in flood season. Shelter ahead. A little later she pointed again toward a low mound hidden under reeds. Tea house once stood there. Only 1 room. Best almond cakes on the marsh route. She said it so matter-of-factly that Samira could almost see the tea house still, bright and tidy, with its cakes lined on blue plates. The marsh did not feel empty after that. It felt layered, like cloth folded over cloth, the old route lying beneath the present one, not gone, just quieter. Near sunset, the channel opened abruptly into a long oval basin, where the wind lost its edges and the water smoothed itself into something like dark glass. Samira understood at once why the old maps called this stretch the Reed Mirror Passage. On either side, the reeds stood in dense walls, and above them the sky lowered itself so clearly into the basin that it sometimes seemed the skiff moved between two evenings, one above and one below. At the far eastern side, half hidden behind drooping willow and tall marsh sedge, she saw the landing. Even ruined, it had grace. A row of leaning pilings marked the old jetty line, some still capped with brass rings gone green. Behind them stood a low house on a timber platform, its roof partly collapsed on one side, its reed screens shredded to ribbons by weather. A broad awning frame extended eastward, though most of its covering had vanished. On one wall clung the pale shadows of hooks where signal cords had once hung. A narrow side platform, perhaps used for drying or sorting, tilted perilously toward the water. Dizzy off to the right rose a small square tower no higher than a man standing on a crate, with slatted sides for wind and a simple copper hook at the top where, perhaps, a lantern or bell once hung. Water lilies drifted where boats had once moored. Birds had claimed the quiet, yet the landing had not collapsed into shapelessness. Its parts still announced themselves: jetty, house, drying rail, signal awning, tide tower. It had been neglected, yes, but not erased. No one spoke for several moments. Some places deserve silence before labour begins. Then Nawal said softly with something like relief, "It remembers itself." Harun guided the skiff to the sturdiest-looking section of jetty and tested the boards before stepping up. Samira followed only where he placed her feet. The planks groaned but held. Close up. The damage became clearer. One jetty beam split, several awning slats missing, roof reeds gone from the western edge, one shutter hanging by a single hinge, old nests tucked into corners, mud crusted over the threshold, silt collected beneath the side platform. Yet there were also signs of endurance. The main posts were hardwood and still good below the weathered surface. The little tide tower leaned but did not sway. Inside the house, a clay hearth remained intact, with a kettle hook above it, and shelves built high to protect goods from damp. A row of shallow wall niches waited empty. Against the rear wall stood the frame of a folding table, and on the eastern side, under the shattered awning, 7 brass hooks still held their places in a perfect line. Samira moved toward them almost reverently. She could see the shadow marks left by the cords that had once hung there. 7 hooks, 7 knots. The landing's name had not been poetic exaggeration. It had been literal, functional, precise. Nawal came to stand beside her and touched the air beneath the hooks without touching the metal itself. "Morning signals here," she said. "Evening signals there on the sideboard. Special weather notices by the tide tower. We change them at dawn, midday and dusk if needed. A keeper's hands were never idle. They did not attempt repairs that first evening. Instead, they made the place safe enough for a night stay." Harun swept a dry area clear inside the house. Iman checked the roofline for loose sections likely to fall. Samira brushed nesting material from the shelves and doorway, working carefully so as not to startle the swallows higher in the rafters. Nawal inspected the posts and beams, tapping each with a small mallet, listening to the sound with the concentration of a musician tuning an instrument. Afterward they shared tea brewed over the revived little hearth, and the ordinary act of steam rising again beneath the landing's roof felt almost ceremonial. Outside, as the light thinned, the basin mirrored a dusky sky, and the first stars appeared both above and below them. Samira sat on the threshold with a cup warming her hands. She looked at the old brass hooks under the awning and imagined lines of signal cords hanging there again, swaying slightly in the night wind, telling the marsh that the landing had returned to attention. At dawn they began in earnest. The first task was not beautifying but clearing, and Samira discovered quickly that bringing a place back to usefulness meant learning what to move and what to leave. Some reeds had rooted beneath the jetty and could be cut safely. Others helped hold silt where it was and would be trimmed later, not pulled. Bird nests in the high rafters were spared. Mud-dauber tubes on the outer wall were left in place. Broken roofing reeds were removed, stacked, and tied for later disposal. Shells were scrubbed. Floorboards were swept, then wiped with vinegar water a man had cleverly packed in a jar. Huron jacked the side platform level with blocks and temporary braces. Nowell cleaned the brass hooks beneath the signal awning one by one with oil and cloth until they regained not shine exactly but readiness. Samira took special pleasure in sweeping the eastern awning floor where signal keepers once stood. There, beneath dust and leaf fragments, she found faint groove marks worn by decades of careful feet. By midday the landing no longer looked abandoned, it looked interrupted. That was a different thing entirely, and a hopeful one. During a pause for bread and figs, Nawal asked Samira to fetch the tide stick. Together they crossed to the small tower. Inside, carved into the inner post, were old measurement lines, some still dark, others nearly lost. Nawal compared them against the tide stick and murmured to herself, "The basin has lifted silt along the western lip," she said. "Not too badly. The middle channel still holds enough depth for modest cargo. The eastern approach may need remarking, though." She showed Samira how to read the old post. Flood marks, dry season marks, and unusual storm notes cut with different tools by different keepers over the years. Each mark represented not only water height, but a decision someone had made. To stay, to go, to unload, to wait. Samira laid her hand against the post, and felt that history was not always parchment and kings. Sometimes it was finger widths cut into weathered wood by people who wanted strangers to arrive safely. That afternoon brought the first small wonder. While clearing the back shelf of the house, Samira dislodged a loose plank and found behind it a shallow compartment holding a wrapped bundle. The cloth had decayed at the edges, but the contents were mostly sound. 3 small ceramic jars sealed with wax, a brass key with a ring shaped like braided reeds, and a stack of thin cedar tablets pierced for hanging. On the tablets were route notes written in faded ink. One recorded wind direction, another listed tea cargo from 3 seasons in succession. A third gave practical advice. If the lilies close before sunset in high heat, wait until moonrise to depart. Nawal laughed softly when she read that. "That would be Yakut," she said, "the second keeper after me. He trusted lilies more than clocks." The ceramic jars proved even more precious. One held dry blue pigment, another held a few surviving copper tacks. The third, to Samira's delight, contained little thread spools in white, green, red, saffron, blue, and grey, the very colours used in signal wrapping. Faded, yes, but intact enough to show exactly how the old cords had been marked. When they returned to Nisra that evening with their first report, the news moved through town as marsh news always moved. Not loudly, not in proclamation, but through doorways, along plank walks, across evening tea, and over the exchange of ordinary objects. By the next morning, everybody seemed to know that Nawal had found the landing of 7 knots still standing, that Harun said the main posts were sound, that Samira had uncovered route tablets, and that the old signal hooks remained in place. People who had scarcely thought of the Eastern Passage in years began remembering odd details. A soap maker recalled that her mother once sent mint blocks that way because they stayed cooler on water than on carts. A basket weaver remembered seeing blue lantern reflections strung across the basin when he was a child. A coppersmith remembered repairing a kettle hook for a keeper whose name he could no longer recall. By afternoon, neighbours had begun offering useful things in the offhand manner of generous towns. Extra reed bundles for patching the roof, an old coil of dock rope, 2 shutters from a dismantled boathouse, a sack of limes for scrubbing, spare nails, a low stool, a tin basin, a bundle of clean rags, and 3 lengths of oilcloth that might still serve beneath an awning. So began the real work, which lasted not one dramatic day but many quiet ones, each with its own rhythm and its own satisfactions. They travelled out to the landing every other morning at first, then for 3 days in a row when the weather held. Samira began to know the channels by the way her hands knew rope. There was the place where the water smelled sweet because the lilies were thick. There was the bend where reeds opened just enough to reveal a patch of distant sky. There was the narrow crossing where Harun always said, "Pole, not oar." On the second work-day, neighbour Jalil the coppersmith came with them, bringing a satchel of tools and a square of leather in which he had wrapped new pins, wire and small hooks. He repaired the hearth hook, reset the brass rings on the jetty posts, and fashioned 2 simple brackets for hanging lanterns under the awning. While he worked, he told Samira that trade routes survived because people believed in the comfort of repeated arrangements. "A traveller comes tired," he said. "He does not want innovation. He wants the hook where a hook should be, the rope where a rope should be, the cup that holds. The board that doesn't tilt, the light that means what it meant last season. Reliability is a kind of mercy." On the 3rd work day, Iman and 2 neighbour women re-thatched the western section of roof, using fresh-cut reeds layered over the surviving frame. Samira passed bundles upward and learned how the butts must lie, how tightly each layer should be tied, and how much overlap the wind required. Meanwhile, Nawal and Harun set about the signal awning. The frame needed only partial replacement. One crossbar had split, so Harun cut a new length from seasoned willow and lashed it with cord dipped in oil. Samira cleaned the 7 brass hooks again, then helped Nawal hang test lines from each one to judge spacing. Niall insisted on stillness while arranging the sequence. "The signal line must never look uncertain," she said. "Uncertainty travels faster than boats." They did not hang the true cords yet. First they measured the drop, the swing, the distance a person should stand back in order to read them at dawnlight, noon glare and dusk shadow. Samira had never before considered that even something as humble as a hanging cord might possess standards, and the discovery thrilled her. A week into the work, they turned their attention to the jetty itself. Some boards only needed cleaning and bracing, others had to be replaced. Harun, who understood wood the way Nawal understood water, showed Samira how to test for rot by pressure and sound rather than appearance alone. Good wood sometimes looked tired, bad wood sometimes looked respectable. The marsh, he said, taught humility in judgments. Together they raised 2 sunken planks, packed the supports beneath with stone and oyster shell, then reset them with fresh pegs. Samira helped scrape old moss from the mooring edges so ropes would grip properly. Eamon stitched padding from worn sailcloth to wrap the inner face of one post, where fragile cargo might brush. Nawal directed everything from a stool like a commander who never raised her voice. When a merchant boat eventually tied there, she wanted the boatmen to feel that people had thought of them before they arrived. Another discovery came on a cloudy afternoon when the air smelled of rain before the rain had made up its mind. Beneath the folded table frame at the back of the house, Harun found a flat panel of wood, warped but not ruined. When cleaned and laid out in better light, the spia, it revealed itself as the evening board, a painted chart on which the day's final notices could be clipped for late arrivals. Most of the original paint had faded, but faint columns remained for depth, wind, shelter, cargo caution, and next stop notes. Nawal's face brightened more than it had at any point since the cedar board's return. "We won't restore it for decoration," she said. "We'll restore it for use." That was always her way. Nothing became a relic in her hands if it could still be practical. Samira sanded the panel, rubbed it with oil, and watched the grain darken. Jalil added fresh copper corners. Iman cut neat strips of waxed cloth for weatherproof notes. By sunset, the old evening board looked ready to speak again. Word spread farther than Nizra. The marsh had its own pathways for news, carried not only by people but by routine. Fishermen told ferrymen. Ferrymen told salt sellers. Salt sellers mentioned it at market to those bringing tea from the north. Within 10 days, 2 small visiting boats arrived at the landing while the family was still working. The first belonged to an elderly soap merchant named Kasim, who had once travelled the Reed Mirror Passage with his mother's cargo and had come simply to see whether the stories were true. He stepped onto the half-restored jetty, looked around slowly and removed his cap as if entering a place of worship. Then he grinned at Nawal with unabashed delight. "So you've come back before the rest of us had the sense to," he said. He unloaded a crate of mint soap blocks and left them with instructions that they be used to clean the remaining walls and shelves because, in his opinion, no trade landing should smell of neglect when it could smell of mint and olive oil. The second visitor was a paper merchant's daughter from farther north, travelling with her husband. She brought waterproof paper tags and a packet of charcoal pencils. "If the route is waking," she said, "it will need writing." By now the landing had become part workplace, part memory school. Samira learned more in those days than she had expected to learn in a month. She learned how to set a kettle so that steam would not dampen stored cloth. She learned that a boat arriving at dusk should always find one dry bench, no matter how crowded the house. She learned that traders carrying glass preferred the quietest side of the jetty, and that paper merchants feared damp more than delay. She learned the difference between knots tied for strength and knots tied for reading. Most of all, she learned to stand beside Noel beneath the awning and read the signal cords as the old woman rebuilt the code from memory, root tablets, and surviving practice. The 7 main chords were not identical. That surprised Samira at first. She had imagined 7 copies with different knots. Instead, each chord was made for its particular role. The first, the depth line, was slightly thicker and hung with a weighted end so it would remain straight even in moving air. The second, for wind and surface movement, used lighter cord and responded more easily to gusts, making it visible from a distance. The third indicated mooring ease, the 4th shelter, the 5th cargo caution, the 6th next channel conditions, and the 7th special notice. Their positions mattered. Their wrapping colours mattered. Whether a knot sat snug or loose mattered. A loop turned outward might mean one thing. Inward, another. Nowell did not try to teach Samira all at once. She believed deeply in layered learning. "The marsh never tells all its truths in one day," she said. "If it did, nobody would come back tomorrow." While the signal system took shape, the landing house itself softened from ruin into hospitality. Iman hung reed screens at the western opening so afternoon sun could be filtered without cutting the breeze. Harun set the folding table on repaired legs and braced it against the wall when not in use. Samira cleaned the wall niches and lined them with scraps of woven mat so cups would not chip. Jalil brought back a repaired kettle, its copper bottom newly firm. Adi Qasim, the soap merchant, sent a second gift, a shallow wooden tray for setting still-wet soap stamps where they would not mark other goods. A woman from the north, in a blue scarf, left 3 stacks of wrapped paper and a note that read, "For route notices and quiet accounting." An old boatman contributed a jar of green paint and muttered that every proper landing needed at least one thing the birds could identify from far off. With it, Harun painted the outer edge of the tide tower door and the 2 central jetty caps, not brightly, just enough that the landing announced itself without shouting. One evening, after a long day of scrubbing and cord work, Samira climbed the little tide tower with Nawal to hang the brass bell from the chest. It was not a warning bell. Its tone was too soft for that. It was the kind of bell meant to mark attention. Nawal tied it with a doubled loop and tested the swing. When the clapper touched, the sound that spread over the basin was no louder than a spoon against a cup, yet it carried with startling clarity. The reeds did not echo it harshly. They held it, then passed it along in a low shimmer. Samira felt the small sound travel into evening like a thought entering sleep. Nowell smiled. "That," she said, "is how you tell the marsh a place is under care." The first true trial of the landing came with weather, as useful things often must. A line of warm wind crossed the basin one night and pushed silt into the eastern approach. By the next morning, the reeds near one entry bend leaned in a new direction, and the water there clouded brown. Nawal noticed before the others had even tied the skiff. Rather than complain, she grew energized. "Good," she said. "Now we find out whether we remember anything." She and Samira took the tide stick along the approach, while Harun poled the skiff slowly behind them. They measured depth in intervals, marked the safer line with floating reeds, then set 2 temporary guide stakes cut the day before. Samira wrote the measurements on wax tags while Nawal dictated. Back at the landing, they changed the 2nd, 5th and 6th chords, adjusting knots and wraps to reflect the shallows. Samira hung the notice on the evening board herself. Midday brought a small cargo boat loaded with covered baskets of dried apricots. The boatman studied the chords, nodded once and followed the remarking line exactly. He tied up without incident, unloaded part of his cargo to rest the boat, and later told Harun, "I haven't seen a proper marsh signal in 15 years. I forgot what relief looked like." From then on, the landing's revival accelerated, though always in the marsh's slow way. No flood of caravans descended. No miraculous crowd appeared. Instead, one boat came, then another, then a week later, 3 in 2 days. A tea seller rested under the awning and left a sack of cracked cups he thought might still serve for workers' tea. A glass bead trader asked if the Karma Basin route could again be trusted for fragile cargo. Nowell answered honestly. For modest loads, yes. For hurried men, no. He laughed and said hurried men should break their own beads elsewhere. 2 sisters carrying dyed thread from the south used the drying rail to air damp cloth after an early mist, and left behind a packet of indigo thread, so Samira could mark future signal cords in a stronger shade. A ledger seller from the north promised to bring weatherproof covers. Even people who did not trade much seemed drawn to the place, perhaps because restoration itself invites imagination. They wanted to see what patience could still accomplish. As the landing grew more useful, so did Samira. Nowell began asking her opinions and not only her help. Look at the third cord from the water, she would say. Would you read mooring ease quickly enough at dusk? Or, if paper cargo ties here and glass cargo there, which post wants softer wrapping? Samira answered cautiously at first, then more confidently. She discovered she liked the responsibility of being exact. She liked that the landing asked for attention rather than grandness. One afternoon, while trimming a frayed line, she realised that forgotten routes returned not because somebody made a speech over them, but because somebody swept a floor, measured water, mended a roof, and hung one correct signal after another until strangers trusted the place again. Nizra itself changed subtly in response. Haroun began making a line of narrower jars better suited to boats, each with padded bases and tight lids. Iman started stitching waterproof cargo sleeves in 3 standard sizes, because merchants kept asking for them. Children on the plank walks began tying pretend signal cords between posts, inventing their own marsh codes with shells and scraps until Nawal, amused, corrected them gently and taught the real meanings of a few simple arrangements. Kasim's mint soap sold better, because traders passing through bought extra for northern relatives. A basket maker cut more reed trays for drying small goods at the landing. Nobody said the eastern water route had returned in full. Marsh people distrusted statements that sounded complete, but they did say that the landing of 7 knots was useful again, and in trade language that was praise of the highest order. Late in the season, when the heat loosened and the evenings deepened sooner, Nawal decided it was time to extend their care beyond the landing itself. A resting place is only as good as the path to it, she said. So they began remarking the reed mirror passage more formally. This did not mean dominating the marsh with posts and paint. It meant choosing restraint wisely. A route should guide without insulting intelligence. At bends where the water still read clearly, they left it alone. At deceptive stretches, they set low, guide stakes wrapped with weather-coded thread. They cleared only enough drift to prevent snagging. They hung one white shell marker at a shelter cove used in storms. Near Heron Bend, they repaired a mooring ring on an old stump so boats needing to wait at moonrise had somewhere safe to tie. Samira wrote careful notes about each adjustment. Nowell had her copy them twice, once for the landing ledger, once for a small waterproof packet stored by the tide tower. Routes fail when knowledge lives in one head alone, she said. We are not restoring a place, we are restoring continuity. One soft grey morning, after rain had spent itself during the night, they received a visitor who mattered very much to Nawal, though Samira did not understand why at first. He was an old man with a beard the colour of marsh grass in winter, and hands broad from decades of poles and oars. His name was Suleiman, and when he climbed onto the jetty, Nawal's whole face changed. It did not become younger exactly, but it became lit from within, as if a lamp had been set behind old paper. Suleiman had once kept the northern staging dock at Lantern Reach. He and Nawal had worked the same route in adjoining stretches more than 40 years earlier. They greeted each other not with dramatic exclamations, but with the easy certainty of people whose respect has survived long silences. Suleiman walked through the landing slowly, tapping rails, inspecting signal cords, studying the evening board. Then he said to Samira, "Who reads with her?" and nodded toward Nawal. When told that Samira did, he looked at her for a long moment and said, "Good. The route will need younger eyes." Old roots die when everyone guarding them is busy remembering how well they once worked. They return when someone young cares how well they can work tomorrow. Suleiman brought gifts that proved more useful than expensive things might have been. He had with him a bundle of slim cypress poles, ideal for longer-lasting guide stakes, and a packet of lantern mica cut to fit small windows. With Harun he replaced the cloudy side panes of the landing's 2 bracket lanterns. With Nawal he compared depth memories and argued gently and with great satisfaction over whether a certain northern inlet had always shifted after 2 nights of east wind or only after 3. With Samira he walked the jetty and corrected her hand position on the mooring line twice, then approved of her knot sequence with a grunt that warmed her more than praise would have. Before leaving he stood by the tide tower and said, almost to himself, "I had forgotten how much comfort there is in seeing a place take its duty seriously." By autumn the landing of 7 knots had acquired its own daily rhythm, and Samira's life began dividing itself into Nizra days and landing days. Nizra days held glazing, errands, cooking smoke, neighbour calls, reed cutting, and ordinary household work. Landing days began before sunrise, with packed baskets, bundled notes, and the cool smell of morning on water. At the landing she swept first every time because Nawal said a cared-for floor changed the posture of everyone who entered. Then she checked the 7 cords. If weather had changed, she adjusted wraps and knots under Nawal's eye. Harun inspected the jetty and moorings. Iman refreshed cups, cloths, and bench coverings. By mid-morning the first boat might come or might not. Either was acceptable. The landing's dignity did not depend on constant traffic. It depended on readiness. Sometimes traders rested an hour. Sometimes a family stayed through the hot middle of the day and shared stories of the north. Sometimes nobody arrived until dusk, when the lanterns had already been lit and the basin reflected their light in 2 trembling lines. Samira came to love even the quiet days, because they revealed what the landing really was. Not a stage for activity, but a promise held in place. There were small ceremonies that developed without anyone formally declaring them. The first arriving boat of the day, if it had travelled more than half the passage, was always offered mint tea before business. Fragile goods were placed on the shaded inner side of the house, never nearest the open reeds. Wet bundles were aired before being stacked. Notes left on the evening board were removed at dawn and copied into the ledger if still relevant. Travellers departing after moonrise heard the tide tower bell once, softly, not as blessing exactly, but as acknowledgement. When children came with families, Samira sometimes showed them the simplest signal cords, and their eyes widened to discover that knots could speak. A few of them began tying better knots at home. Even Fadi, who at first cared only about whether the landing had interesting frogs nearby. He grew proud when told to sort spare shell weights by size for Samira's work. As trade deepened by little degrees, the kinds of goods passing through the landing revealed once more why this quiet route had existed in the first place. Wheels on dry roads suited heavy bulk and hurried travel. The reed mirror passage suited care. Tea came without being jolted. Paper stayed flatter. Glass beads arrived with fewer chips. Fresh herbs remained cooler under damp cloth on water than on sun-struck carts. Soap took less dust. Fine thread did not snag as much. Even the smell of cargo changed. A cart road smells of leather, hoof dust, and heat. The marsh route smelled of reed shade, cool boards, tea leaves, waxed paper, mint oil, cedar, rope, and damp clay. Traders began planning accordingly. Some split their goods, he sending sturdy items west by cart and delicate ones east by water. Others who prized unbroken cargo returned to the old route entirely. Samira listened to these decisions with fascination. She had thought trade was mostly about what was bought and sold. Now she saw it was also about choosing the right path so that goods remained themselves. One evening, while the basin held a broad rose-coloured sky and dragonflies skimmed low over the reeds, Nawal asked Samira to sit with her under the eastern awning after the last boat departed. The 7 cords hung quiet in the cooling air. Beyond them the water reflected the first lantern light. Nawal held the cedar signal board they had found in the fisherman's skiff months before. Its surviving green-wrapped cord had long since been matched and studied. Now it rested mostly as a reminder. "Do you know," Noel said, "why this place mattered more than some larger houses?" Samira considered. "Because the water stayed calm here." That helped. "Because fragile cargo could wait safely?" "Yes." "Because people trusted the signals?" Noel nodded. "And why did they trust the signals?" Samira looked at the cords, then at the old woman's hands. "Because someone paid attention every day." Noel's smile was small and satisfied. "Exactly. Forgotten trade routes are not only forgotten because roads shift. They are forgotten because attention thins. The route is still here. The water did not vanish. The reeds did not conspire against us. What vanished was daily care. The kind that notices depth, changes knots, sweeps floors, fills kettles, copies notes, checks shutters, and remembers that travellers arrive as tired people before they arrive as merchants. When care returns, routes remember themselves." That idea stayed with Samira more deeply than any single practical lesson. From then on, she began looking for care in everything. She noticed which bench a traveller chose when shy. She saw that Iman always placed the cleanest cups nearest the kettle, but not too close to the heat. She saw that Harun inspected mooring wraps more often after glass cargo days. She saw that Nawal, however tired, never left an unclear signal overnight. Care was not dramatic. It was cumulative. It made trust possible. Winter in the marsh did not arrive in one sweep. It gathered. The reeds browned at their bases. Mornings came with pearl-coloured mist. Boat poles felt colder in the hand. Breath showed briefly above teacups. New trade slowed but did not cease. In some ways, the landing became even more valuable then because fewer routes remained pleasant, and those who did travel wanted certainty. The drying rail earned its keep under damp skies. Lantern mica glowed warmer against long grey afternoons. One family from the north arrived with wool lengths wrapped in oilcloth and stayed through an evening rain, grateful beyond words for the tight roof and dry hearth. A scribe transporting ledgers paused to rewrap his cargo, and later sent Samira a little packet of wax tablets as thanks. Suleiman visited twice to compare winter notes with Nawal. Together they decided the Shelter Cove marker should be doubled during mist weeks. Samira updated the ledger with great seriousness. She no longer felt like a child helping elders with nostalgia. She felt like part of the route. On the longest night market week, when Nizra lit doorways with low lamps and neighbours exchanged sweets wrapped in paper twists, the landing of 7 knots held its first winter rest gathering in many years. No proclamation announced it. It simply happened because enough people had come to rely on the place and wanted to honour that reliance. Harun took 6 glazed tea jars. Iman sent honey cakes. Kasim delivered mint soap tied with white thread for good weather. The paper merchant's daughter brought folded note cards edged in blue. 2 bead traders from the south hung a chain of tiny glass pendants under the awning, where they caught lantern light and returned it in soft green flashes. Suleiman came with a bag of chestnuts. Nawal insisted on ordinary working signals being kept in place even during celebration, because a landing could be festive and useful at once. Boats tied up quietly along the jetty. People drank tea, shared route observations, traded small goods, and spoke in the lower voices that water invites. Samira stood near the tide tower at one point and looked back toward the house. Lantern light glowed from its windows. The brass bell moved slightly in the breeze. Reflections doubled everything below. It seemed for a moment that the landing floated between 2 worlds, the remembered one and the living one, stitched together by work. After winter, the route gained confidence. That is the only word for it. Confidence not as pride, but as steadiness. Traders began sending messages ahead. Will the 6th cord be updated by midday? Can paper rest overnight this week? Is the eastern approach good for double basket tea loads? Questions like these delighted Nawal, because questions meant expectation, and expectation meant the route had become dependable enough to be included in plans. To help manage this, Samira started a second ledger devoted only to recurring patterns. Mist weeks, lily behaviour, silt drift after warm south winds, safe loading limits for certain hull shapes, the best days for northbound bead cargo, the times when the basin held evening calm longest. Her handwriting grew firmer, her summaries grew clearer. Nowell sometimes corrected a word, but less and less often. "Right for the traveller who is tired," she said. "Tired eyes need simple truth." During spring flood rise, when the marsh swelled and some old channels briefly remembered former widths, the possibility emerged of restoring one more stop beyond the landing, a minor shelter platform at Heron Bend, where boats once waited before night crossings. The platform was too small and too ruinous for a full revival that season, but Samira and Harun went with Suleiman to inspect it. They replaced one mooring ring, cleared the safest approach, and set a temporary marker. Returning to the landing of 7 knots that evening, Samira felt the scale of the route widening in her imagination. What if one restored place could help another? What if a landing revived not just its own jetty, but the idea that these water roads still deserved use? Nawal, hearing the inspection report, did not sound surprised. "Of course," she said. "Routes wake by segments. One cared for stop teaches people to believe in the next." By now, even visitors who had never known the old marsh system began speaking of the landing as though it had always belonged to their travel plans. A young couple transporting carved wooden boxes stopped to dry a damp tarp and said they preferred the basin because their goods arrived without corner cracks. A grandmother carrying embroidered linens to her married daughter farther north rested at the landing and left behind a cushion she had sewn herself, for whichever old bones need it next. 2 brothers moving lamp oil asked Samira to explain the special notice cord so they could teach their sons. A quiet boy, not much younger than Fadi, spent an hour watching her tie knots, and then admitted he liked them better than letters, because they could be felt in the dark. Samira showed him the simplest depth sequence, and saw in his pleased concentration the beginning of another kind of memory. Nawal aged, of course, as seasons continued. Her hands remained precise, but she tired sooner after long damp days. Sometimes she sat more than she once had. Sometimes Samira noticed her pausing at the end of a task, looking not weary exactly, but inward, as if listening to distances no one else could hear. Yet her attention never loosened. If anything, it sharpened further, because she knew better than anyone that continuity must be placed into younger hands before old ones set things down. She began having Samira handle the dawn signal alone while she watched from the bench. Then she had her judge the midday wind line without prompting. Later, she asked her to explain route notes to arrivals while she listened from inside. These were tests, but gentle ones. Samira accepted them with pride and humility. She understood, though it was not spoken directly, that Nawal was not merely teaching tasks, she was transferring guardianship. One soft evening in early summer, exactly a year after the cedar signal board had returned from the fisherman's skiff, Nawal brought the board to the landing and placed it above the inner shelf, not as decoration alone, but as beginning made visible. Beneath it she set a freshly written card in Samira's hand. Returned by water, remembered by work. Heron hung the board securely. Iman wiped the shelf and placed a sprig of mint in a small cup below it. Then they all stepped back. The phrase was simple, yet it seemed to hold the whole year inside it. Samira felt suddenly how much had changed. The roof sound above them, the signals in order, the ledger shelves full, the jetty firm, the kettle hanging ready, the route alive again in modest but undeniable ways. That night several boats tied at the landing, more than usual for that stage of the season. A tea merchant from the north, a soap boat from the south, a family carrying rolled reed mats, and a quiet skiff with paper wrapped in waxed cloth, all shared the basin. After supper, when most conversation had softened into low murmurs, Samira climbed the tide tower platform and looked out. The lanterns under the awning cast long reflections, each trembling slightly with the water's breathing. Beyond them, farther along the basin than she could have seen clearly a year earlier, one of the guide stakes caught moonlight. Then another. Then the pale shell marker near the shelter cove. Small points, modest points, but enough to suggest a route continuing into dark in confidence rather than in guesswork. She understood then that forgotten trade routes did not return as monuments. They returned as sequences, stake to stake, knot to knot, lantern to lantern, person to person. When she climbed down, Nawal was waiting with 2 cups of mint tea. They sat together on the eastern bench while the 7 cords hung motionless in the warm night. For a long while they said nothing. Then Nawal handed Samira a small wrapped bundle. Inside lay a set of polished shell weights, smoother and finer than the ordinary ones, each marked with a tiny cut line. "These were mine," Nawal said. "Now they're yours." Samira touched them carefully. "I can borrow them," she said. "Because some gifts feel too large to claim at once." Nawal shook her head. "Not borrow. Keep. The root has a room for your hands now." Samira wanted to answer beautifully, but beauty rarely comes when one asks for it. In the end, she said the truest thing. "I'll pay attention." Nawal's smile deepened. That is the whole work. Years later, people passing through the Eastern Marsh would speak of the landing of 7 knots as though it had always been there in that reliable form. The swept floor, the shaded bench, the mint tea, the careful notices, the correct signals at dawn, the bell tone at moonrise, the soft lantern reflections doubled in the basin. Some would remember Nawal and say that an old tide reader brought the place back from neglect. Some would remember Harun's sound jetty repairs, Iman's dry screens, Jalil's copper hooks, Qasim's mint soap, Suleiman's cypress stakes. Many would remember Samira because she remained, season after season, beneath the eastern awning with steady fingers and clear eyes, tying the day's meanings into chord. Children learned from her. Travellers trusted her notes. Traders adjusted plans by her signals. And though other routes would rise and fall, and some West Road merchants would always prefer wheels to water, the Reed Mirror passage no longer lived only in old speech. It lived in use. In the morning, Samira would often arrive before full sunrise, sweep the floorboards while birds began in the reeds, and listen to the basin waking itself into colour. Then she would check depth, wind, mooring ease, shelter, cargo caution, next channel condition, and special notice, one by one. Just until the 7 chords hung with the honest clarity the day required. Sometimes the notices were favourable and simple. Sometimes they advised patience. Either way, she came to understand the quiet dignity of telling the truth about a route. Travellers do not ask old roads to flatter them. They ask to be guided faithfully. And so the forgotten trade route endured not as a grand rediscovered marvel, but as something gentler and perhaps more precious. A place where fragile cargo travelled with less breakage, where paper stayed dry, where tea crossed cool water in dawn mist, where soap carried mint scent northward, where lantern light taught reflections to shine twice, and where one generation placed its knowledge carefully into the hands of the next. In Nisra, if evening settled softly and someone heard a distant bell from far across the reeds, they would sometimes pause in their work and say with quiet satisfaction, "The landing is awake." Then they would return to their bowls, nets, ledgers, jars, or stitching, comforted by the knowledge that somewhere along the marsh, under a reed awning at the edge of still water, the 7 chords were hanging true. If you'd like to return again to these calm, forgotten trade routes, where lanterns glow over quiet water, careful hands keep old paths alive, and even a single knot can guide someone safely home, you can softly subscribe, come back whenever night grows long, and keep travelling with me through these patient roads of memory beneath the stars.